A man walked into a small cafe in Gibson, Louisiana on a warm May morning and ordered a fried bologna sandwich. The order could not have sounded more ordinary. A cheap cut of meat went into a hot pan, white bread waited beside the stove, mustard and onion gave it a bite. In the middle of the Great Depression, that kind of food carried no romance. It was warm, fast, filling, and cheap enough for a traveler who still had miles ahead of him. Outside the cafe, a stolen Ford V8 sat in the dust. The man was Clyde Barrow. According to the marker in Gippsland, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow stopped in a Ma Canefield's cafe around 9 o'clock on the morning of May 23, 1934. Local history remembers the cafe as their last stop before the ambush. They picked up food in town, got back into the car, and drove toward a rural road where lawmen were already hidden and waiting. Several miles down the road, breakfast would turn into history. Gippsland was a small Louisiana town in a country that had been worn thin by hunger, debt, and disappointment. By 1934, the Depression had changed the way America sounded. Men stood outside stores with nowhere to work. Families stretched flour, beans, coffee, and pride as far as they would go. Store counters saw more looking than buying. Tires ran longer than they could have. Clothes were patched until the repair told its own story. A cafe in a town like Gippsland mattered because it gave the road a place to pause. A person could step out of the heat, order something affordable, and sit under a roof before the world demanded movement again. Fried bologna belonged to that world. It was a depression food, built from what people could afford and what would hold them over into the next meal. Bonnie and Clyde became famous by then, but fame in their case did not look like glamour up close. It looked like sleeping light, moving fast, trusting almost nobody, and reading newspapers that turned their lives into a running public story. They were young, poor, armed, and wanted. They had robbed, kidnapped, run from police, and left real victims behind. There is no honest way to tell the story without saying that. There is also no honest way to separate their story from the country around them. Banks had failed, farms had failed, jobs had disappeared. A lot of Americans lost faith in law, money, and power. Now, that hardship did not justify what Bonnie and Clyde did, but it helps explain why some people watch their story with a strange mix of fear, resentment, curiosity, and sympathy. That tension followed them into Gippsland. The story goes that Bonnie stayed inside the car while Clyde went in for the food. Local tradition says Bonnie got a BLT and Clyde got the fried bologna sandwich. With a story like this, the exact details live partly in documentation and partly in the memory of a town that has repeated that moment for generations. That is why the careful wording matters. According to the marker, Ma Canefield's was the last stop. Local history remembers the sandwich. I understand the weight of that stop better after standing in Gippsland myself. I have been to the same place where Clyde ordered that fried bologna sandwich. The place makes the story feel smaller in the best and strangest way. The road is close, the town is quiet, the distance between an ordinary counter and a fatal stretch of highway feels short enough to make you feel uncomfortable. It's no longer just a paragraph in a book or a scene from a movie. It becomes a place where a hungry man ordered food before getting back into a car he would never leave alive. Today they call this sandwich the Clyde. It has 2 pieces of white toast, fried bologna, mustard, and onion. No fancy description improves it. The plainness is the point. A man who had become a national headline was still hungry enough to order the kind of sandwich any broke traveler might have recognized. After Gippsland, the road led south toward Bentonville Parish. The Barrow gang had ties in that area through Henry Methvin, and lawmen had been watching those connections. The ambush partly included officers from Texas and Louisiana, with former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer playing the central role in the pursuit. Clyde had already proven how dangerous he could be, and the Ford gave him speed that most police cars just couldn't match. The officers believed the road itself had to become the trap, so they waited where the road gave them a chance. The scene down that rural road was quiet before it was violent. Pine trees lined the way. Morning heat rose off the dirt. Dust hung low where tires had passed. The lawmen stayed hidden with rifles ready, listening for the engine of the car they believed might not stop unless was forced to. Bonnie and Clyde drove toward them with food from Ma Canefield's. The food in the car changes the shape of the ending. A wrap sandwich sat somewhere in the car. A morning errand had been finished. The road ahead probably looked like every other road they had taken while running from town to town, hiding place to place, danger to danger. By May of 1934, the circle around Bonnie and Clyde had tightened. Every town could be dangerous. Every stop could be reported. Every friendly face could be a trap or a mistake. Their names were too known, their faces too printed. Their enemies too close. The life they had chosen and the life of the Depression had helped press around them, had narrowed to gas, food, weapons, and movement. Then the Ford came into view. The gunfire was overwhelming. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow died on that road on May 23, 1934, not long after leaving Gippsland. The chase ended in seconds, but the public story kept growing. The car became famous. The photographs became famous. The names became fixed in American memory. Ma Canefield's remained tied to that last ordinary stop. The sandwich matters because legends have a way of pulling people away from the ground. They can make criminals look more stylish, lawmen look simpler, poverty looked cleaner, and violence looked less terrible than it was. The sandwich pulls the story back into the heat and dust of 1934, where a small cafe, a cheap meal, and a stolen Ford all occupied the same morning. When I think about that place now, I don't picture a grand historical stage. I picture a counter, a road, and a meal simple enough to disappear from almost any other day. The fried bologna sandwich does not redeem Clyde Barrow. It does not erase the fear of Bonnie and Clyde caused, or the lives damaged along the way. It does something smaller and more useful. It keeps the final morning human. A man orders food, a woman waits in the car, a town goes about its business. Lawmen sit hidden down the road. By itself, a sandwich is just a sandwich, but in Gippsland, that white toast, fried bologna, mustard, and onion became attached to the final minutes before the ambush. It belonged to the Depression, to a small cafe, to a stolen Ford, and to a decision to keep driving. 7 miles later, no one in that car could take the morning back.
Most outlaw stories end with a lawman's gun, a roadside ambush, or a body stretched out in the dust. The Newton brothers' biggest crime ended because of one of their own men fired into the dark and hit Doc Newton. Before that night, Willis, Doc, Jess, and Joe Newton had already built one of the strangest outlaw reputations in America. They were 4 Texas brothers tied to Uvalde, raised around poor farm work, bad money, and hard living. Willis carried that bitterness the deepest. After prison and years of trouble with the law, he stopped looking at crime like a desperate act and started treating it like a trade. By the early 1920s, the Newton gang had a system. They looked for banks in small towns where the safes were old, the law was thin, and the telephone lines could be cut before anybody knew who to call. They often worked at night. They used explosives on safe doors, loaded the money, and left before the town could gather itself. Imagine being asleep above a store in a quiet Texas town and waking to a blast that rattles the windows. By the time people found their shoes and stepped into the street, the robbers were moving towards the edge of town. The banks would be damaged, the safe torn open, and the phone dead on the wall. The Newtons later leaned into the idea that they robbed without killing, but the softer version needs correcting. Armed men do not become harmless because they prefer planning over gunfire. During a robbery in Toronto in 1923, Willis Newton wounded 2 messengers when the job turned violent. Their care did not make them innocent. By 1924, the brothers wanted a score bigger than any small-town bank could offer. The target was the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul mail train near Roundout, Illinois. Mail trains carried more than letters. They carried cash, bonds, securities, jewelry, and registered valuables moving through the country under federal protection. The gang had inside help and waiting cars. 2 of the brothers got aboard the train as it left Chicago. Once it was rolling north, they climbed into the engine cab and forced the engineer to stop near the place where the rest of the crew waited. The train passed the planned stopping point. In a robbery built on timing, distance suddenly mattered. Men who had assigned positions had to adjust in the dark, with the train sitting wrong and the crew nervous. Robbers moved where other robbers did not expect them. Glasscock, one of the gang members, saw a figure in confusion and thought he was looking at the threat from the train. The man shot was Doc Newton. Doc went down with 5 bullets in him. For a few minutes, a bad plan can feel genius. The mail sacks were there. The valuables were there. The cars were there waiting. When the gang had to carry the wounded brother with the loot, every advantage they thought they had started turning into a problem. Doc's wounds pulled the Newtons back towards Chicago. They needed a doctor, a room, and people willing to keep quiet. Postal inspectors and police followed those loose ends. The haul was reported around $3 million, making it one of the largest train robberies in the United States history. But the wound mattered more than the number. The bullet gave the law a trail. The brothers were caught, prison followed. Much of the stolen property was recovered or returned. The score that was supposed to buy freedom became the job that ended the gang. Willis Newton wanted crime to behave like work: pick the target, know the weakness, use the tool, and leave before the town wakes up. For a while, that approach made the Newtons successful enough to become legends. Roundout stripped the romance of the method. A train stopped short, a man moved wrong in the dark, another man fired too fast. All the planning in the world had to share space with panic. Years later, some of the brothers returned to Uvalde and became old men with outlaw stories behind them. The crimes became folklore because time has a way of making danger look cleaner from a distance. But the heart of the story stays beside that train in Illinois. The Newton brothers were careful enough to rob banks across the country and bold enough to stop a mail train near Chicago. Then their biggest robbery collapsed because the man bleeding in the getaway car was one of their own. They spent years trying to control crime. On the night that made them famous, crime answered back.
The grave had already been dug, but the crowd kept coming. By late afternoon, the road to Atkins Cemetery had turned into a river of dust. Cars crept in from Silisal, where the dry Oklahoma air carried powder across fence lines, coats, hats, and windshields. People leaned from running boards and wagon beds for a better look. A child was lifted above the crowd just long enough to see the casket moving towards the grave. At the center of all this was Charles Arthur Floyd, 30 years old, dead 6 days, and coming home to the soil that had helped him turn into a legend. The rest of the country knew him as Pretty Boy Floyd. On October 22, 1934, Floyd had been killed near East Liverpool, Ohio, after days on the run. By October 28th, his body was back in Sequoia County. More than 20,000 people were reported at his funeral, with some accounts placing the number even higher. At the time, it was remembered as the largest funeral Oklahoma had ever seen. A crowd like that does not gather around a man unless his story has moved beyond the facts of his life. Floyd was born in Georgia in 1904, but Oklahoma put its stamp on him. His family moved near Silisal when he was a boy. He grew up among poor farm people and country where land could feed a family one year and ruin it the next. Work was constant, security was not. Cotton really didn't care how tired a man was, and debt didn't care how honest he had been. When the Great Depression tightened its grip, that hard life became something meaner. Banks foreclosed farms, families lost houses, animals, tools, and the little dignity that comes from believing tomorrow might be better than today. A man could spend his whole life trying to stay even, then find himself beaten by a piece of paper signed inside a building he could barely enter. In that climate, the word bank carried a different weight. It didn't sound respectable to families who watched neighbors driven off their land. It sounded cold, distant, and final. So when Floyd robbed banks, the story landed in dangerous territory. To lawmen, he was a violent fugitive with a gun in his hand. Around Silisal, he could still be remembered as Charlie Floyd, the poor farm boy who had come out of the same country as everyone else. Those two versions never fit together cleanly. Floyd carried guns and ran with criminals. His name belonged to a world where men died suddenly and families were left to live with the damage. No funeral crowd and no Depression legend could wipe that away. But stories gathered around him faster than facts could settle. People remembered cash appearing when food was scarce. The old mortgage paper story followed him everywhere, with Floyd supposedly destroying records during bank robberies so farmers could keep their homes. Whether every version can be proven is almost besides the point. Hard times give rumors work to do. To people who had lost nearly everything, Pretty Boy Floyd offered a story where the bank was afraid for once. Then came Ohio. Floyd died far from the roads he knew best. His body was prepared, viewed, and sent home by train. By the time it reached Silisal, the funeral had already begun to outgrow the family. The viewing drew crowds too large for a normal farewell. People moved through the funeral home with the quiet pressure of a public event, Flowers arrived in such numbers that they became part of the spectacle, and strangers stood close to the body as if proximity could make the legend easier to understand. On Sunday, October 28th, the procession moved towards Atkins Cemetery. Dust rose behind cars and hung over the road. The line stretched for miles. At the cemetery, the flowers remained one of the cleanest images of the day. So many arrangements that several cars were needed to carry them while Floyd's family tried to keep a burial from becoming a show. The service itself remained plain. Scripture was read, hymns moved across the dry air, a coffin waited beside an open grave while thousands of people pressed against the edges of a moment meant for a much smaller circle. A bank robber could become beloved when ordinary people believed the respectable world had already robbed them first. Floyd's crimes did not vanish at Atkins Cemetery, neither did the grief attached to the violence around his name, but the crowd showed how broken the depression had made the country around him. In a world of foreclosures, hunger, and humiliation, even an outlaw could be mistaken for justice if he pointed his gun at the right enemy. When the coffin went down, the crowd leaned for one last look. Then the dust took the road again. Oklahoma watched Pretty Boy disappear, but his mother lost Charlie.
The FBI said they had just killed the most dangerous woman in America. She was 61 years old, gray-haired, and dead in a rented house beside Lake Weir, Florida. Her son, Fred Barker, lay dead next to her. The newspapers knew what to do with that kind of ending. They gave her a name that sounded bigger than a real person, Ma Barker, the mother of criminals, the woman behind the gang, the old lady who supposedly planned robberies and kidnappings, prison breaks, and murders while her sons carried out the work. It made a clean story. America was in the middle of the Depression, and the country had grown used to outlaws becoming famous. John Dillinger had been killed in 1934. Bonnie and Clyde had been shot down the same year. Pretty Boy Floyd was dead. The public was reading about crime like it was a traveling show, and the federal government was trying to prove it could bring order back to a frightened country. Then came Ma Barker, and she gave the whole era something it wanted, a villain with a family name. But the real woman was harder to fit on a front page. She was born Arizona Donnie Clark in Missouri in 1873. Later, she married George Barker and raised 4 sons, Herman Lloyd, Arthur Doc Barker, and Fred. The boys did not all fall into crime all at once, but over time, the Barker name became tied to robbery, prison time, violence, and fear. Herman died after a robbery went bad. Lloyd served time behind bars. Doc added to the family's criminal reputation. Fred became the son most closely tied to Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, the man who helped turn the Barker name into something national. Fred and Karpis met in prison. Once they were out, ordinary life was gone for both of them. They moved through the Midwest under false names, using stolen cars, and carrying enough weapons to bring federal attention down on them. By the early 1930s, the Barker Karpis gang had moved beyond bank robbery. Kidnapping became their bigger business. In 1933, they kidnapped William Ham, a wealthy Minnesota brewer, and collected a large ransom. In 1934, they kidnapped Edward Broomer, a banker from St. Paul, and that crime pushed the Bureau even harder. These were rich men taken in daylight, held for ransom as the headlines kept growing. And in the middle of that, Kate Barker kept appearing beside her sons. That is where the legend grew teeth. The Bureau later presented her as the mind behind the gang, the woman who controlled the men around her. It was a powerful image, an old mother directing hardened criminals while pretending to be harmless. But Alvin Karpis later remembered her differently. In his telling, Ma Barker was kept outside the actual planning. The men did the criminal work. She lived near it, traveled with it, and was protected by the money it brought in. That version does not make her innocent. She lived with men who were running from the law, and she accepted the shelter their crimes paid for. She never left the sons whose lives were surrounded by violence. The old FBI version makes the ending in Florida almost simple. If Ma Barker was the mastermind, then the shootout becomes easy to explain. The Bureau surrounded a criminal genius. She fought back, and she died the same way any outlaw might die. The messier version leaves a harder picture. By January of 1935, the Bureau was closing in. Doc Barker had been arrested in Chicago on January 8th. During that investigation, agents found information that pointed them towards Lake Weir, Florida, where Fred Barker and his mother were staying in a rented house near Ocklawaha. The place must have looked peaceful from the outside. Florida air, water nearby, a quiet house far from the cities where the gang had made its name. Before dawn on January 16th, federal agents surrounded it. They called for Fred and Ma Barker to come out. The people inside did not surrender. Tear gas went in, gunfire came back. What followed was a long, violent standoff that turned a lakeside hideout into the last room of the Barker story. When the shooting ended, agents entered the house and found Fred and Ma dead. From there, the Bureau's version and the newspaper version moved together. Ma Barker was no longer just Kate Barker, the mother of 4 criminal sons. She became the wicked old woman of the Public Enemy era, the hidden hand behind a gang that had frightened the Midwest and embarrassed the law. That version was easier to remember. It gave the Barker gang a center. It put a face on a scattered world of sons, robbers, kidnappers, hideouts, and dead men. But when you strip the legend down, what remains is colder. A family had rotted from the inside. Sons had chosen violence so often that it became the family weather. Their mother stayed near them until there was nowhere safe left to stand. The final image is not a mastermind at a table planning the next job. It's a Florida house before daylight, a map with Lake Weir circled, and an old woman inside with a son that she would not leave. Imagine walking into a barber shop, picking 3 numbers as a way to try to put food on the table. Sure, most of the time you'll lose it, but it only takes one time to earn enough money to feed your family. This illegal gambling operation provided many jobs to folks who couldn't find work. And in Harlem, New York, it was ran by the Queen. Stephanie St. Clair was born in the West French Indies on December 25th, 1897. Stephanie's mom worked hard to send her daughter to school at a time when education felt like a distant dream. When she was 12 years old, Stephanie's mother became very ill, causing young Stephanie to have to leave school. She made it to New York in 1912, picking up English along her way. Her first scrape with the law was to try and sell drugs with the help of her boyfriend Ed. After making $30,000 in the illegal drug trade, she decided it was time for her to part ways with her man. Ed had different plans as he tried to strangle her. Unfortunately for him, she cracked his skull against the table and he died. Just as the old saying goes, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. After killing her boyfriend, she spent months employing her own men, paying off police officers, and investing $10,000 of her own money into an illegal gambling lottery in Harlem. Due to her success in the game, she earned the name of Madame St. Clair. Madame St. Clair was involved in policy banking, which meant a mixture of investing, gambling, and playing the lottery. Banks at this time wouldn't accept Black customers, so they had to find other ways to invest their money. The numbers game, as they called this illegal lottery, was a male-dominated industry that provided many jobs to them when work was scarce. St. Clair was able to amass a fortune of $20,000 a year in the 1920s, or $3.3 million in today's money. Madame St. Clair would take some of this money to release ads in the local newspaper, educating residents of their legal rights and bringing light to the police brutality at the time. Officers responded by arresting her on trumped-up charges, and she spent 8 months in custody. In response to this, she testified to the Seabury Commission about the kickbacks she had paid police officers. This resulted in the firing of more than 12 officers. After the end of Prohibition, the mafia started to see a decrease in profits on alcohol and decided to get into the Harlem gambling scene. A man named Dutch Schultz decided to beat and kill numbers operators who wouldn't pay him for protection. St. Clair and her bodyguard, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, refused to pay protection to Schultz. St. Clair attacked the storefronts of businesses that ran Dutch Schultz gambling operations. The police found out about Schultz and raided his house, arresting more than a dozen of his employees and seizing more than $190 million in today's money. After St. Clair's struggles with Schultz, she decided to go legitimate and pass her illegal business to Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy negotiated with Lucky Luciano a deal that would send a percentage of Schultz's old business going to Bumpy. Lucky would have to go to Bumpy first if he had any issues in Harlem. Schultz was fatally wounded in a shooting that was ordered by the mafia in 1935. Although St. Clair wasn't directly involved in the hit, she sent a telegram to Schultz on his deathbed saying, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." Because, yeah, she was that kind of woman. The telegram reportedly made headlines across the nation. By the 1940s, Johnson became the king in Harlem, and Madame St. Clair became less and less involved in the numbers game. During her retirement from the numbers game, St. Clair became involved in political reform. In the late 1930s, she met her husband, Sufi Abdul Hamid, who was a labor leader most known for his role in the business boycotts in Harlem that protected against discriminatory employment practices. Hamid went off to have an affair with a fortune teller named Fudum. Madame St. Clair found out about this affair and shot down Hamid in cold blood, ending their marriage. St. Clair was sentenced 2 to 10 years in the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for women in New York. After her release from the prison in 1940s, Madame St. Clair lived a secluded life as a prosperous, legitimate businesswoman. She wrote columns in her local newspapers about discrimination and the police brutality facing the Black community. In 1969, shortly after her 72nd birthday, St. Clair died quietly and wealthy. Bumpy Johnson, who had come back to live with her and write poetry, died 1 year earlier. Even after all the fame, her death was not mentioned in any newspaper of the time.
Imagine being kidnapped and blindfolded on a Texas farm. Your ability to memorize the exact times heard by passing commercial airplanes, a daily chore routine, and the changes in temperature will lead the FBI to bring down one of the most known Prohibition-era gangsters, Machine Gun Kelly. George Kelly Barnes, or as he was better known, Machine Gun Kelly, was born in July 18, 1895, in Memphis, Tennessee. Kelly's life of crime would begin when he enrolled in Mississippi State University to study agriculture. Kelly was often considered a poor student, and it's said that his highest grade of a C+ was awarded for his good hygiene. He was at constant odds with the faculty and spent much of his time trying to work off punishments he brought on himself. During this time, he met a young woman named Geneva Ramsey, whom he fell in love with. Kelly decided to quit school and marry her. During the Prohibition era of the 1920s, Kelly worked as a bootlegger. In 1926, after struggling with holding a steady job, heavy drinking, and a spiral into crime, he divorced his first wife, Geneva. With several run-ins with the law, he decided to head west. To protect his family and to stay on the run from the police, he decided to change his name to George R. Kelly. He continued his crime spree and bootlegging until he was arrested in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for smuggling liquor onto an Indian reservation. He was sentenced to 3 years at Leavenworth Penitentiary, Kansas, beginning February 11, 1928. Kelly was released early for being a model inmate and met Kathryn Throne. Throne was an experienced criminal who bought Kelly his first Thompson submachine gun. The firearm was purchased at Wolf & Clark Pawn Shop for $250 in Fort Worth, Texas. According to legend, he was so proficient in his marksmanship that he could write his name in machine gun rounds. In September of 1930, the couple was married in Minneapolis, Minnesota. According to a 1938 book authored by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, the Kellys and Eddie Dahl kidnapped a wealthy manufacturer in Scott Glen, Indiana for $50,000 ransom. If you trust Hoover's claims, it is assumed he is referring to the January 26 abduction of Howard Arthur Wolverton. Wolverton was released unharmed 24 hours later, and the crime was largely forgotten. Kelly made the history books when he kidnapped a wealthy Oklahoma City resident by the name of Charles F. Urschel and his friend Walter R. Jarrett. The couple held Urschel at a farm that belonged to Kathryn's parents for a ransom of $5 million in today's money. Even by being blindfolded, Urschel made note of his experience. He reported different background sounds, counted footsteps, and leaving footprints on surfaces within reach. This evidence led the FBI to discover he was being held in Paradise, Texas. An investigation concluded that the Kellys were hiding in Memphis. Special agents were dispatched to Birmingham, Alabama to capture the Kellys. In the early morning of September 26, 1933, a raid was conducted on the residence of J.C. Titchener. George and Kathryn Kelly were taken into custody by FBI agents and Memphis police officers Thomas Watterson and Sergeant William Rainey. It was reported that Machine Gun Kelly was arrested without a weapon. This arrest would be overshadowed by the escape of 10 inmates who would later form the Dillinger gang in Indiana that same night. An investigation in Coleman, Texas disclosed that Kelly had been housed and protected by Casey Earl Coleman and Will Casey, and that they were assisting in storing $73,250 of the Urschel ransom money on his ranch. The important part about the Urschel ransom case was that it was the first criminal trial that was allowed to be filmed. Also, kidnapping was made a federal crime, and this was the first major case to be solved by the FBI, as well as being the first case to involve defendants being transported by airplane. Both George and Kathryn Kelly were sentenced to life in prison. Machine Gun Kelly was a model inmate and served his last 21 years in prison. 17 of those years were spent on the famous Alcatraz, where he was inmate number 117. Kelly was transferred back to Leavenworth in 1951, and on July 18, 1954, his 59th birthday, Machine Gun Kelly died of a heart attack and was buried at Cottondale, Texas Cemetery in Kathryn Kelly's father's family plot. Kathryn was released from prison in 1958 and lived in private under the name Lara Cleo Kelly until her death in 1985 at the age of 81.
Clark Gable walks to the electric chair on a movie screen. Moments later, under the marquee lights outside the Biograph Theater, John Dillinger will walk to his own death. No judge, no jury, no trial, just G-men waiting for him to walk outside. 92 years later, people still stop in that alley to talk about it. On a hot Chicago summer night of 1934, John Dillinger is living under a fake identity. He has received plastic surgery to hide from G-men who are investigating him for allegations of bank robbery and murder. He is staying with Anna Sage and Polly Hamilton. At this point, he is public enemy number 1, a title given to him by J. Edgar Hoover of the Bureau of Investigation. In the middle of being on the run, he is still found at baseball games, eating at fancy diners, and going to the movies. His manhunt is national news, but he continues an ordinary city life. Dillinger doesn't have any grand ambitions. He just wants a quiet night out on the town watching a movie in the air-conditioned movie theater with 2 women that he has come to trust. Chicago was in the grip of a deadly heat wave that would claim the lives of 23 that week, and the promise of an air-conditioned, cooled movie was the reason enough for him to leave his apartment. Trust was in short supply for a man who had already changed his face. Sage and Hamilton were 2 of the only people alive who knew exactly who he was and had yet to turn him in. Dillinger wants to stay hidden and outlast the manhunt. He desires to be a nobody. He's tired from being on the run and losing all of his friends along the way. Anna Sage is facing a deportation back to her native country of Romania. The government has flagged her as an alien of low morale character due to the brothel that she has been running. There's a $10,000 bounty on Dillinger's head, and she has decided to try to work out a deal with the Bureau of Investigations to save herself from deportation. She promises to wear distinctive colors so that the G-men can verify that the man she is with is in fact John Dillinger. This is how she is to become known as the Lady in Red. At about 10:30, Manhattan melodrama comes to an end. The doors of the Biograph swing open and the audience steps into a heavy Chicago night. Dillinger emerges between Polly Hamilton and Anna Sage. They begin to walk south along the Lincoln Avenue. Melvin Purvis, the agent directing the operation, is waiting beneath the marquee. He watches as Dillinger, who has altered his face, dyed his hair, and concealed his eyes behind tinted sunglasses, passes him beneath the theater lights. Purvis strikes a match and lights a cigar. To the everyday passerby, this is nothing more than an everyday act. But to agents positioned nearby, it means one thing. The man leaving the theater is John Dillinger. Purvis gives another signal with his hand, and the agents begin to close in. Some move from the opposite side of the street. Others fall in behind Dillinger and follow at a slow walk. Dillinger moves ahead of the two women, then he looks back. The quiet night is over. According to federal agents, Dillinger sees the men closing in around him and moves toward a nearby alley. He reaches into his right trouser pocket, where inside is hidden a Colt 380. The gun will never leave his pocket. Agents Charles Winstead, Clarence Hurt, and Herman Hollis open fire. 5 shots through the crowd of the Lincoln Avenue. 3 of those rounds strike Dillinger in the back. He stumbles forward and falls face down on the pavement. The entire confrontation lasts only seconds. Behind him, the audience is still pouring out of the biograph. The marquee remains lit. Manhattan melodrama has ended, but another gangster has reached the end of his story. John Dillinger, public enemy number 1, is dying on a Chicago sidewalk. The federal agents insist Dillinger was reaching for his weapon. The coroner's jury accepts the account and rules his death as a justifiable homicide. This decision takes less than 20 minutes, but the location of the wounds creates questions that follow the Bureau long after the gunfire stops. The fatal bullet entered through the back of Dillinger's neck before passing through his head and exiting beneath his right eye. To those who had already viewed him as a folk hero, it looks less like an arrest and more like an execution. Death does nothing to end the public's fascination with John Dillinger. His body is taken to the Cook County morgue, where it becomes an attraction. Thousands of people file past the body over the next day and a half. Some come to make certain the most wanted man in America is really dead. Others simply stare at the outlaw whose face has filled newspapers and movie screens across the country. Death masks are made, photographers crowd the body. Outside the biograph, souvenir hunters press handkerchiefs and pieces of newspaper into the blood left behind on the pavement. Even in death, the public wants to take a part of John Dillinger home. His remains are eventually placed in a temporary wicker casket and returned to Indiana under police escort. Crowds gather as the hearse reaches Mooresville. And temperatures climbing above 100 degrees, people form long lines outside of the funeral home for another opportunity to see him. The body is later taken to the home of Dillinger's sister, Audrey Hancock. Thousands more gather nearby, although the funeral service itself is private and attended primarily by family and close friends. On July 25, 1934, John Dillinger is buried in the family plot at Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. Thousands line portions of the route, and thousands more will wait nearby the cemetery gates. The hearse enters through another entrance to avoid the largest crowd. The government has finally stopped John Dillinger, but it cannot stop the people from turning his death into one final public performance. He went into the biograph hoping to disappear into an ordinary crowd. 3 days later, a crowd follows him to his grave.
Before John Dillinger left an escape-proof jail, he passed around a hat in order to take a collection of almost $400 in today's money. Armed with 2 machine guns taken from 33 officers locked in cells and a stolen car from a female sheriff, he was able to escape a county jail guarded by more than 50 officers. How did a prisoner become so completely in control that his captors helped pay for his getaway? On a beautifully warm, sunny January day in 1934, John Dillinger was captured with members of his gang. After much debate, a local judge decided that he was to be transferred to the custody of the state of Indiana and to be brought to Crown Point. Here, he was awaiting trial for the killing of East Chicago police officer William Patrick O'Malley. Dillinger was almost certain to be sent to the electric chair for this offense. Local authorities publicly described the Lake County Jail as escape-proof. His confinement quickly became a media spectacle. Dillinger posed for photographs and newsreel footage with Sheriff Lillian Hawley, Prosecutor Robert Istel, deputies, reporters, and other officials. The famous image of Dillinger resting his arm on Istel made the authorities appear far too comfortable with their prisoner, especially after he escaped. Dillinger wants to escape before he can be tried and possibly sentenced to death. He had already spent most of his adult life incarcerated, approximately 9 years in Indiana prisons. He had only been free for several months before being captured again. Crown Point threatened to return him permanently to the system he had only recently escaped. He wanted to rejoin his surviving criminal associates and recover control over his own movements. Dillinger wanted to avoid being a celebrated prisoner who finally ended up in the electric chair. He was able to turn the authorities' confidence against them. The Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana was heavily guarded by over 50 officials. At this time, this was a small jail, but the extra security was due to John Dillinger's reputation of escaping. Dillinger wasn't able to simply overpower everyone from behind locked bars. He had to acquire something that looked enough like a gun to make the first person follow orders. According to a private investigator, Art Leary, Louis Burkett, Dillinger's defense attorney, smuggled a wooden gun into the jail and a hollowed out Bible. This was Plan B. Plan A was to blow up the county jail with dynamite, but that proved to be too dangerous. Burkett didn't act alone. It is reported that he bribed high-ranking Lake County officials with $3,500 in cash that was exchanged at a saloon down the street from the jailhouse to ensure the guards looked the other way. The gun only solved the first barrier. Dillinger had to get the jail employee close enough to threaten. Once he did that, he had to obtain the keys, prevent an alarm, and capture additional guards before they understood what was happening. He had to secure real weapons and find transportation. During the morning routine on March 3rd, Dillinger confronts jail trustee Sam Cahoon with a wooden pistol and obtains access to the keys. From there, jail personnel are reportedly brought into a secured area individually and imprisoned. Dillinger eventually gains access to real firearms, including two .45 caliber Colt Model 1921 Thompson submachine guns belonging to the jail. In a strange turn of events, the prisoner has now become the jailer. Dillinger chose a fellow prisoner named Herbert Youngblood to leave with him. Once the guards and staff are under control, Dillinger reportedly puts on a coat and hat belonging to someone inside the jail and announces that he needs money for his escape. The captives contribute approximately $15 to the cause, an amount of $400 in today's money. The collection wasn't really about the money, it was Dillinger demonstrating that roles inside the jail had been completely reversed. Some accounts say that Dillinger struck or tapped the wooden weapon against the cell bars, revealing that the original gun was a fake only after he had obtained real firearms and secured the jail. By the time his captors learned the first weapon was wood, the distraction no longer mattered. Dillinger and Youngblood made their way to the jail garage and took Sheriff Lillian Hawley's V8 Ford. They left with hostages who would later be released unharmed. The result of the escape is an immediate victory for Dillinger, who escapes the supposedly escape-proof jail. Not a single shot was fired to initiate the escape. He was able to lock the staff behind bars and leave with real weapons while taking money from his captors, then leaving with a stolen car that helped him get to Illinois. But the biggest issue that reverses his victory is the stolen car. By driving a stolen automobile across the Indiana-Illinois state line, Dillinger violated the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act. That gave the Federal Department of Justice Bureau of Investigation authority to finally pursue him. Finally, he broke a crime that allowed J. Edgar Hoover a reason to enter the story. He might have escaped local custody, but the method he chose turned a state fugitive into a federal target. The escape also permanently damaged the reputations of Crown Point officials. Estill's friendly photograph of Dillinger became especially damaging, while Sheriff Hawley endured criticism that often was explicitly sexist. The humiliation did not come merely from losing a prisoner. It came from appearing publicly comfortable with him before he made fools out of the jail staff. The wooden gun may have been false, but everything it produced was real. The locked cells, the missing sheriff's car, and the federal charge along with the national manhunt. Dillinger had entered Crown Point as its prisoner, but he left as a man who had humiliated an entire country. The Bureau of Investigation now had what they needed to legally pursue him. Before the escape, the image appeared to show officials displaying their famous captive. After the escape, the same photo and newsreel video looked like Dillinger had already taken possession of the room. The arm around the prosecutor's shoulder becomes more ominous in retrospect.
Bonnie Parker's remembered for smoking cigars and pointing guns at Clyde Barrow. Only problem is she most likely never fired a gun and begged her hostages to inform people that the cigar picture was a gag. But somehow during the Great Depression, she was able to find a fashion of her own. What was Bonnie Parker trying to communicate through her fashion style, and what did America decide that they meant? In early 1933, Bonnie Parker was a 22-year-old fugitive living an exhausting and unglamorous lifestyle. Yet, in surviving photographs, she appears well put together. She wears a fitted knit garment, long skirt, hat, jewelry, and dress shoes beside a polished V8 Ford. As chaotic as her life may seem, her appearance is not. Most of her clothing is not actually luxurious. In fact, it's actually consistent with an ordinary woman of the 1930s. What made photographs remarkable was the contrast of everyday clothing, weapons, cigar, and a stolen automobile. Bonnie never left a statement explaining her fashion code, but she did seem to want to appear feminine despite living on the run in a male-dominated world of crime. She made sure to look fearless for the camera, almost as if she wanted to transform poverty and fight into something that resembled romance and adventure. She wanted to maintain an ordinary identity underneath a public fascinated by newspaper headlines of Bonnie and Clyde. Although she was legally married to Roy Thornton, it is a myth that she was wearing her wedding ring at the time of her death. Her heart belonged to Clyde Barrow. This is confirmed by her mother in the 1933 book titled Fugitives. Bonnie would pose for the camera, but she could not control what happened to the photographs she took. When the police raided the Barrow Gang's hideout in Joplin, Missouri, police discovered and newspapers developed the film of photographs that Bonnie is most known for today. Newspapers removed the playful context. The public saw a woman violating nearly every expectation of respectable femininity. A skirt and a fashionable hat paired with a pistol and cigar? Bonnie's cousin Bess said, Bonnie was scared to death of guns. Grandpa had one he kept under his pillow, a whopping big old-fashioned pistol. And whenever we made the beds, I was the one who had to reach under and lift it out gingerly and carry it at arm's length to the dresser. Once or twice, Bonnie touched it without knowing that it was there, and such screaming I've never heard. Bonnie Parker used clothing to remain a woman inside an outlaw life, but the press used the same outfits to make her appear more dangerous. Thus, the feminine outfits didn't soften the photograph. It made the pictures more sensational because of the contrast. The press turned the borrowed cigar and the stage pose into proof of a cigar-smoking female gunfighter. Bonnie reportedly became so irritated by that image that she later told a released captive, "Tell them I don't smoke cigars." The clearest turning point is not a wardrobe change, it's the moment the photographs change ownership. Before Joplin, they were private snapshots, Bonnie and Clyde playing beside a car. After police developed them, they became imagery of two wanted criminals, newspaper material, and evidence of a violent Depression-era gangster. Her clothes stopped belonging to her and became a part of the public costume. The patterned knit garment, tilted hat, long skirt, pistol, and cigar were no longer separate objects. Together, they create the visual for Bonnie Parker. The manufactured image would survive and become more successful than the woman. In the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, we started to see the image transform into something it never was. We see actress Faye Dunaway dressing in a style more reminiscent of the 1960s than the 1930s. We see berets, fitted knits, midi skirts, scarves, and a hairstyle that Bonnie didn't even know was possible during her time. The wardrobe drew from the surviving photographs, but it turned into a 1960s beatnik-influenced costume. This film isn't a precise reconstruction of what the real Bonnie wore living on the run. Bonnie's private joke had become her permanent public identity. Hollywood converted a desperate fugitive wardrobe into high fashion. The world remembers a completely different image of the outlaw who, in reality, lived a very painful and precarious life. The cigar joke became more memorable than nearly anything that Bonnie had said about herself. Bonnie Parker's secret fashion code was not a hidden message planted in every outfit. It was a creation due to the collision of ordinary femininity of the time compared with outlaw props, newspaper sensationalism, and Hollywood glamour. Bonnie attempted to control the camera for a few seconds, but the photograph controlled her reputation for the next century. Her clothing did not reveal the real Bonnie Parker. It revealed what America wanted Bonnie Parker to be. The most famous piece of her outlaw costume, the cigar, was never truly hers. The woman disappeared in 1934, but the outfit continued living without her.
John Dillinger is laying inside an ordinary Chicago house rather than a hospital. An anesthesiologist places an ether mask over his face. Dillinger suddenly turns blue and stops breathing. The doctor has to pull Dillinger's tongue forward and revive him. After nearly dying, Dillinger still allows the operation to continue under local anesthetic. This is not some cosmetic surgery. He is attempting to remove the physical identity of a man being hunted across America. In the spring of 1934, Dillinger reached a point where hiding under another name is no longer enough. After escaping the Lake County Jail at Crown Point, see our video on that event here, he stole the sheriff's automobile and drove it across the Indiana-Illinois state line. That act gave federal authorities jurisdiction and brought the federal government directly into the hunt. His photograph, physical description, and fingerprints were being circulated to law enforcement offices across the country. In the weeks that followed, the pressure increased. He escaped a confrontation with agents at the Lincoln Court Apartments in St. Paul and suffered a gunshot wound to his leg. His associate Eddie Green was shot and later died. Dillinger's girlfriend, Evelyn Billy Franchette, was arrested. Dillinger escaped another federal operation at the Little Bohemia Lodge in Wisconsin. Newspapers were repeatedly printing his face, transforming him from a fugitive into one of the most recognizable men in America. By late May, he was hiding at 2509 North Crawford Avenue in Chicago, the home of James Probosco. This was not an underground clinic. It was a private residence being used to hide fugitives and perform illegal surgery. Court records placed Dillinger's operation here on May 28, 1934. Dillinger doesn't plan to look slightly different. He wants to separate himself physically from every wanted poster, mugshot, and fingerprint card attached to his name. According to accounts based on Dr. Lazar, the man performing the surgery, Dillinger asked for several identifying features to be altered. He wants to remove the moles around his forehead and eye, a depression in his nose, a scar in his upper lip, his facial dimples, the shape of the corners of his mouth, and the contours of his cheeks and chin. These are small changes, but together were the details police would use when comparing a suspicious man to a photograph or physical description. Dillinger paid a total of $5,000 in 2 payments for this surgery. This was the sum of $120,000 in today's money. His fingerprints were a big problem. An alias might fool a landlord or nightclub employee, but fingerprints could connect him to his criminal history. By 1934, fingerprint identification was so established that the federal court later described it as the surest known method of identifying criminals. Dillinger wants 2 things: a face that strangers will not recognize and hands that police cannot identify. Dillinger can't enter a legitimate hospital under his own name. Doctors, nurses, paperwork, and visitors would all increase the possibility of discovery. The operation, therefore, takes place inside Probosco's house, surrounded by people who know they are hiding a federal fugitive. The house provides secrecy, but it does not provide the safety of a properly equipped operating room. The doctor performing the operation is Dr. Wilhelm Lawser. Lawser has a troubled reputation involving narcotics and offenses and connections with Chicago's criminal underworld. That makes him useful to Dillinger because he's willing to perform work that a conventional physician would regularly refuse. It also means that Dillinger is placing his life in the hands of someone operating outside legitimate medical practice. Dr. Harold Bernard Cassidy is a physician that is in charge of administering the anesthetic. He attempts to place Dillinger under general anesthesia with ether. During the process, Dillinger reportedly turned blue and stopped breathing. Lozer later described taking emergency action to open his airway and revive him. The facial operation then continued, using a local anesthetic. Lozer reportedly removed moles, worked around Dillinger's nose and upper lip, altering his chin, and attempted to tighten or reposition portions of his cheeks. The fingerprint work appears to have been a later phase rather than being something completed during the original facial operation. On June 3rd, Lozier and Cassidy worked on Dillinger and a fellow fugitive, Homer Van Meter, at the same house. The court record confirms that Van Meter's operation, the presence of Dillinger, and the payment of another $5,000 for Van Meter's treatment. Lozier cut through the outer skin of the fingertips and applied corrosive substances in an attempt to destroy the ridge patterns. Accounts vary slightly regarding the precise chemical preparation, but it's said that the treatment was provided by a combination of acid and other caustic chemicals. The fingertips were bandaged, leaving Dillinger unable to use his hands during the recovery. Dillinger emerges physically changed, but not transformed into another person. His moles, scars, and facial contours have been worked on. His fingertips are wounded and bandaged. He had endured a procedure serious enough to nearly stop his breathing, yet the changes were limited. Accounts from people around him indicate that he was not completely satisfied with the facial results. Dillinger said, "Hell, I don't look any different than I did," after staring into the mirror. The fingerprint procedure was almost failing beneath the bandages. The chemicals damaged certain portions of some prints, but much of the surrounding ridge detail survived and became visible again as the fingertips healed. A later examination of prints taken after Dillinger's death found that most of the ridge patterns remained intact. Dillinger began the operation believing identity is something physical that can be removed. A doctor can cut away a mole, close a dimple, or burn a pattern from a fingertip, but after the operation, Dillinger remains surrounded by people who know exactly who he is. The surgery also changed the nature of the manhunt. It's no longer a search for a bank robber. Now, federal agents are investigating his attorney, the two doctors, the homeowner, and fellow fugitives receiving similar treatment. To attempt to erase one man's identity creates evidence against an entire group. Less than 2 months after the facial operation, federal agents are waiting when Dillinger left the Biograph Theater on July 22nd, 1934. He was shot in the back while leaving the theater with 2 women. He was pronounced dead later that night. Prints taken from his body showed the heel damage caused by the attempted mutilation. The central areas had been affected, but most of the identifying ridge patterns remain. A forensic study published in 1935 used Dillinger's prints as an example of why attempts to obliterate fingerprints were generally futile. Dillinger was not defeated because an agent looked at his face and recognized him. Authorities reached him through information supplied by someone within his social circle. The face had changed, but his relationships, habits, and associations still led investigators to him. John Dillinger could damage the marks that identified him, but he could not cut John Dillinger out of his own life.
Elastic bands were tightened around the fingers of the last public enemy number 1. The doctor injected cocaine into each fingertip as an anesthetic. The patient described the procedure of scraping his fingertips as the motion of sharpening a pencil. This intensely painful procedure was the result of a man trying to elude the federal investigators' new methods of tying criminals to crime scenes. What frightened one of America's most dangerous criminals enough to let a doctor carve the ends of all 10 fingers. The Barker Karpis gang had been operating around St. Paul in 1933. Alvin Karpis and Fred Barker had moved beyond ordinary bank robbery and into kidnapping wealthy businessmen for large ransoms. In June of 1933, the gang kidnapped William Ham Jr., president of the Ham Brewing Company. Ham was forced to sign several ransom notes and was released after payment of more than $100,000. The kidnapping itself appeared to have succeeded, but the gang had left something behind that they could not see. On September 6, 1933, the FBI laboratory used silver nitrate to reveal latent fingerprints on the ransom notes. Ordinary fingerprint powder did not work very well on absorbent paper, but silver nitrate reacted with the salt left behind in perspiration. The FBI describes the Ham investigation as the first surveillance forensic application of this method to expose prints on evidence that could not be dusted. Prints connected to Alvin Karpis, Arthur Doc Barker, and other gang members to the kidnapping. Karpis could change automobiles, addresses, clothing, and aliases. He could wipe down a weapon or abandon a hideout, but the FBI could now recover evidence from a piece of paper that appeared clean. The pressure grew after the January 1934 kidnapping of banker Edward Brumer. Brumer was released after his family paid $200,000, but the physical evidence again helped investigators connect members of the gang to the crime. By March, Karpis and Fred Barker were being publicly identified as suspects. Karpis was no longer only running from witnesses who might recognize his face. He was running from marks he had left behind every time he touched something. Karpis wanted to sever connection between his fingerprints and the criminal record attached to his name. He had already been arrested and imprisoned before joining the Barker gang. Law enforcement possessed earlier fingerprint records that could identify him even when he used an alias. Any new print recovered from a ransom note, automobile, weapon, or hideout could potentially be compared with those records. Karpis and Fred Barker contacted Joseph P. Morgan, a Chicago physician known within the criminal underworld. Karpis later said Barker paid $500 while Karpis paid $750 because Moran also performed work on facial injuries Karpis attributed to a police beating several years earlier. Gloves could not stop him from leaving fingerprints during one crime, but Karpis wanted a solution that would follow him everywhere he went. Joseph Moran was not operating as a conventional surgeon treating a normal patient. He was an underworld physician willing to alter fugitives who could not safely enter a legitimate hospital or explain their injuries and identities through ordinary paperwork. The FBI confirms that several members of the gang resorted to backroom surgery in an effort to conceal their fingerprints and appearances. According to Karpis's later description, Moran began looping elastic bands tightly around each finger near the first joint. These apparently restricted circulation and bleeding while Moran worked. He then injected cocaine into each fingertip. Cocaine was used medically as a local anesthetic during this period. Karpis remained conscious and aware of what was happening. Moran worked with a scalpel, scraping away the fingertip tissue deeply enough to disrupt the friction ridges. Karpis compared the process to sharpening the ends of a pencil. When Moran completed one finger, he removed the constricting band and wrapped the wounded cotton before moving on to the next one. Karpis said the fingerprint operation was damn painful. Even if Moran successfully destroyed the original ridge pattern, the operation successfully created other problems. Karpis needed time for 10 finger wounds to heal. The damaged fingertips could themselves become distinguished marks. Moran knew the identity and location of 2 major fugitives. The procedure could make ordinary police suspicious rather than Karpis appearing normal. Removing his prints could not erase the prints that he had already left on evidence. The original fingerprints were heavily disrupted, although faint ridge details reportedly remained. Once federal authorities knew that fugitives were mutilating their fingertips, the absence of normal fingertips could itself attract attention. During the national search for Karpis, police reportedly instructed to detain suspicious people with mutilated fingertips. Before this operation, police could identify Karpis through his normal fingerprints. After the operation, they could identify him as a man with 10 deliberately mutilated fingertips. A surgery may have complicated a direct comparison with old fingerprint cards, but it could not turn his hands into ordinary hands. Scarring and faint remaining ridges still created physical evidence. At the same time, Karpis remained free for roughly 2 more years. It may have made conventional fingerprint comparison more difficult, but it did not protect him from surveillance, informants, criminal associates, and mistakes made while moving around the country. On May 1st, 1936, federal agents surrounded Karpis as he entered a Plymouth coupe outside of his New Orleans hideout. J. Edgar Hoover was present and publicly associated himself with the arrest. When Hoover ordered agents to place Karpis in handcuffs, none of them had brought a pair, so an agent's necktie was used to secure his hands. After the arrest, the FBI photographed the damage to his fingers. The photographs were not evidence that old fingerprints had returned. It had documented what Moran had done and transformed Karpis's attempt at concealment into part of official record. Karpis pleaded guilty in connection with the Ham kidnapping and receiving a life sentence. He entered Alcatraz August of 1936 and remained there for approximately 26 years before being transferred. He was eventually paroled in 1969 and returned to Canada. Several historical accounts state that the mutilation caused Karpis difficulties when he later needed Canadian identification or passport credentials.
In Franklin County, Virginia, the police were supposed to stop illegal moonshine. Instead, some officers allegedly collected monthly payments from the men making it. The people who paid were protected. The people who refused could be raided, arrested, and driven out of business. Caught inside this system were 3 brothers who would later become the inspiration for the movie Lawless. How did one Virginia county turn prohibition into an organized business involving moonshiners, police officers, politicians, merchants, and murder? This story takes place in Franklin County, Virginia, during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Prohibition made the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages illegal, but it did not eliminate the demand. In rural communities, illegal distilling became a way for farmers and working families to turn corn, sugar, and labor into money. Franklin County's mountains, isolated roads, wooded areas, and long tradition distilling made it an ideal place for illegal whiskey production. Large quantities of sugar grain, canes, and other supplies moved through the county. This caused Franklin County to gain a national reputation as one of the most active moonshine producing places in America. Our story starts with 3 brothers named Howard, Forrest, and Jack Bondurant. These brothers would produce and transport illegal liquor and become part of the county's local folklore. Forrest Bondurant was remembered as physically tough and intimidating. Family stories claim that the brothers survived so many injuries that they were thought of as being indestructible. Making whiskey was dangerous, but the greatest threat was not always getting caught. It was refusing to cooperate with the people who controlled who got caught. The Bondurant brothers want to earn money, operate independently, avoid arrest, and not be controlled by officials or rival moonshiners. Jack is the youngest of the three, and he wants to be respected by his older brothers and prove himself to the world. He doesn't want to be the inexperienced little brother that has to be told what to do. He wants to share the money and the reputation of the family business. The county's corrupt officials want control over the local liquor economy. They want to collect protection payments every month, political power, and the ability to decide who can operate a moonshine business in their county. The officials didn't want moonshine eliminated. According to testimony, the system was more profitable when moonshine continued under their control. Depending on who you were, you'd be charged between $10 and $50 per still a month. Those who paid would receive warnings about raids, protection from arrests, and the ability to continue operating. Your agreement worked as long as everyone paid. The trouble began when someone decided that the law was not entitled to their share. Officials reportedly divided the county into districts, collected the monthly fees, and kept track of cooperating moonshiners and targeted bootleggers who wouldn't participate. One of the strangest allegations was the confiscated liquor and equipment could be resold. This meant that whiskey could potentially create profit several times. The moonshiner paid protection to produce it. Officers would confiscate it in a raid, receive the credit, and then sell the same liquor back to them. According to Franklin County newspaper records, during a robbery of his restaurant by a couple local thugs, Forrest Bondurant's throat was sliced from ear to ear. Forrest famously showed up at a hospital roughly 10 miles away in the snow, gripping his own neck. When doctors asked how he got there, he claimed he walked. This incident earned him the title of Rasputin of the Hollers. On December 19, 1930, Jack and Forrest were shot during a confrontation with deputies near Magotty Creek Bridge. Authorities claimed that the brothers were transporting a large quantity of liquor and offered deputies money to allow the load through. Deputy C.L. Rakes was indicted for maliciously shooting the brothers. Deputy Thomas Jefferson Richards was believed to have information about the conspiracy and have kept records connected to the protection payments. Before he could be called in as a major witness, he was murdered while transporting a prisoner. His vehicle was struck by bullet rounds and buckshot. Richards' death was widely connected in the public mind to the conspiracy, although the full motive was never conclusively established. The Commonwealth had an attorney by the name of Charles Carter Lee. He was a prominent and local prosecutor and powerful political figure who was accused of helping manipulate the legal system. Witnesses accused him of contradictory roles of prosecuting liquor violations locally while representing some defendants in federal matters. Lee was tried but acquitted. The conspiracy might have continued indefinitely if the federal government had not began assembling witnesses, financial records, shipping records, and testimony from inside the operation. Federal authorities began reconstructing the county's moonshine economy through witness testimony, sugar and grain purchases, store accounts, information from distillers and drivers, and evidence connecting officials to the illegal trade. The enormous quantities of moonshine moving through Franklin County helped show that this was not a collection of isolated backyard stills. The conspiracy case became one of Virginia's largest and most complicated criminal proceedings. The trial lasted 49 days, had more than 200 witnesses, and around 36 defendants made up of law enforcement officers, public officials, merchants, and liquor operators. 20 defendants were convicted after the trial, and the rest entered guilty or no contest pleas. Before the investigation, the liquor system operated through secrecy, fear, cooperation, and local power. The trial forced the county's hidden relationships into public testimony. Numerous defendants were convicted, but the total punishment was relatively limited compared with the scale of the alleged operation. Combined prison sentences reportedly totaled only around 18 years. The federal government established that millions of dollars in liquor taxes had been avoided. Some convicted participants allegedly returned to illegal activity or remained influential in the community. The official transcript disappeared from the courthouse. Researchers have attempted to reconstruct the proceedings through newspaper coverage, interviews, family accounts, and partial documents. But what about the Bondurant brothers? The brothers survived the Prohibition period and became local legends. Their reputation grew because of Forrest's throat injury, the bridge shooting, the moonshine stills, the refusal to disappear quietly, and the secrecy surrounding their lives.
The most wanted man in America at that time is standing at a registration desk of a Havana hotel when an American stranger asked him to move aside. The wanted man, Alvin Karpis, politely stepped back. then found himself riding alone in the elevator with the stranger. Karpis decided that the man was a salesman based off of his winter suit. Hours later, he found out he was wrong, and the man was in fact FBI federal agent Lloyd Kingman. How did one of America's most wanted criminals escape to Cuba after coming face to face with a man sent there to find him? In September 1934, Alvin Karpis and Fred Barker divided money from the Edward Brimmer kidnapping. Karpis knows the FBI's campaign against Depression-era gangsters is becoming increasingly aggressive. Remaining in Chicago or Cleveland carries a growing risk of arrest or death. Karpis decided to disappear without telling most of his criminal associates where he is going. He leaves Chicago with Dolores Delaney, his pregnant girlfriend. They drive towards Florida using aliases and appearing to look like an ordinary couple taking a vacation. Karpis nearly ends his escape before reaching Miami when a Florida state trooper stops him for driving 85 miles an hour. Karpis tells the trooper he is traveling to Miami and questions whether Florida has a speed limit. Instead of inspecting the car or arresting him for reckless driving, the trooper warns him to slow down and lets him leave. The officer has no idea the driver is a wanted kidnapper traveling with weapons and ransom money. In Miami, Karpis checks the El Comandoro Hotel, which is known for its connections to the underworld figures. Hotel manager Joe Adams agrees to help dispose of the car, machine gun, and bulletproof vest. Karpis and Dolores buy warm weather clothing before continuing to Key West. On September 18th, they board the steamship Cuba for a 6-hour journey to Havana. Karpis has escaped the American mainland, but Havana itself is not what he is looking for. He doesn't want casinos, crowds, or nightlife. He wants a place where no police officer, FBI agent, or fellow criminal will know where to find him. At the Parkview Hotel in Havana, Karpis meets owner Nate Heller, a man recommended by his contacts in Miami. Karpis makes his desire clear. He wants somewhere quiet, isolated, and away from the police. Heller warns him that Cuba is potentially unstable and explained gunfire and violence are very common every night. Soon after arriving, Karpis experiences instability himself when a bomb explodes near Prado. Crowds move towards the explosion, but Karpis runs in the opposite direction because he knows that police will soon fill the area. He has escaped from American crime only to arrive in the middle of Cuban political violence. Heller eventually finds him a 6-room beach house outside of Veradero. The house sits near white sand and blue-green water. It comes with a small motorboat that Karpis uses for fishing. Karpis and Dolores spend their days walking the beach, gathering seashells, eating, and relaxing. They hire domestic help, none of whom speak English enough to ask dangerous questions. For approximately a month, Karpis appears to have obtained exactly what he wanted. For the first time in years, he is not planning a kidnapping, studying a bank, or watching for federal agents. He begins believing that he may have successfully disappeared. But Karpis has not escaped his reputation. His face is appearing in magazines, his ransom money is circulating internationally, and the FBI is beginning to look beyond the United States. During a trip to Havana, Karpis visits George's bar, using the name Mr. Wagner. The proprietor's wife shows him a detective magazine containing a photograph of the Barker-Karpis gang. She studies the photograph and then studies Karpis. She remarks that the criminal in the magazine looks remarkably similar to Mr. Wagner. Karpis attempts to laugh with her instead of reacting defensively. Karpis attempts to buy the magazine so it cannot be shown to anyone else. The woman refuses because she wants to show the resemblance to her friends. The bar owner recognizes the danger and pressures her to take Karpis's money. Karpis escapes the counter, but he knows that his face alone could expose him. News from America reaches Karpis through the radio. He learns that Pretty Boy Floyd has been killed. A short time later, Babyface Nelson is also killed after a confrontation with federal agents. These deaths tell Karpis that the FBI is no longer merely building criminal cases. The men who once dominated the newspapers are being captured or killed. one after another. Karpis realizes that remaining there eventually may be as dangerous as returning to America. At a Havana branch of the Royal Bank of Canada, Karpis exchanges a $1,000 bill. He notices that some of the smaller bills he receives carry Minneapolis Federal Reserve markings. He believed he recognizes them as money connected to the Bremer kidnapping ransom. The money was supposed to have been moved through Caracas and Mexico. The traceable ransom money could give the FBI a reason to begin searching for him in Havana. Karpis returns to Havana to determine whether Cuba is still safe. At the Parkview Hotel, the danger he has been imagining steps directly in front of him. On December 3, 1934, FBI agent Lloyd E. Kingman arrives in Havana. Kingman is searching for the Barker Gang associate Willie Harrison. He carries photographs and plans to search racetracks, bars, nightclubs, hotels, and other places frequented by American expatriates. Kingman enters the Parkview Hotel and waits to register. A man standing in front of him continues speaking with the desk clerk. Kingman asks the man to move so he can sign the registration card. The man turns and politely allows him through. The man is Alvin Karpis. Karpis watches Kingman register and notices that he looks unmistakably American. He studies that felt hat, winter clothing, and mannerisms that seem out of place in tropical Havana. When Kingman enters the elevator behind him, Karpis becomes more suspicious. The two men riding alone in silence. Karpis steps off and returns to his room. He considers leaving, but eventually convinces himself that Kingman is probably a traveling salesman. Later, Nate Heller urgently asks Karpis to meet him outside. Heller reveals that the stranger is an FBI agent. During their conversation, Kingman had produced a photograph of the criminal the Bureau wanted most. Heller tells Karpis that the photograph was his. Kingman has also asked about transportation towards Matanzas, the province containing Veradero. Before this moment, Karpis only suspects that the FBI may be searching Cuba. Now he knows that an agent carrying his photograph is moving toward the area where Dolores is eating in their beach house. Karpis has spent months trying to disappear. Now, he only has hours to abandon everything before Kingman reaches Veradero. Karpis leaves Havana immediately and drives through the night towards Veradero. He reaches the beach house at approximately 3 in the morning. He awakens Dolores and tells her that they must leave. They do not explain their departure to the servants. At dawn, the quiet life they had built is abandoned. Karpis drives Dolores directly to the Havana airport because she is heavily pregnant. Traveling together by boat could make them more easier to identify. He places her on a flight to Miami and tells her he will follow. Karpis remains in Havana briefly to determine how close the FBI is and whether the agents are arriving from the United States. The next morning, he goes to the docks and boards the steamer for Key West. He watches the passengers and studies the crowd for police officers. Once inside the cabin, he waits for the ship to depart. Every additional minute on that dock gives the FBI another opportunity to find him. Finally, the engines begin moving and the ship pulls away from Havana. Karpis escaped Cuba before Kingman realizes that the man from the hotel desk was the fugitive standing in his own photograph. Karpis traveled to Cuba believing an ocean could separate him from the FBI. Instead, he encountered a political bombing, was nearly exposed by a detective magazine, and stood alone in the elevator with the federal agents searching for him. He did not leave because the FBI found him. He escaped because, through an extraordinary piece of luck, he discovered them first. Would you have recognized Alvin Karpis standing beside you at that Havana hotel desk? On a wet, chilly evening in early May 1934, every one of the 1,000 seats in the Glory B Theater in Miami, Oklahoma is filled. People are standing in the aisles. The film Sucker Money has just ended when 13-year-old Geraldine Arnold steps behind the microphone. Less than just a year earlier, Geraldine has been an ordinary 6th grader. Now a packed theater is waiting to hear how George Machine Gun Kelly and his wife Kathryn used her as a shield while fleeing across the country. Geraldine Arnold is an ordinary 13-year-old schoolgirl who enjoys spending her time with friends. Her parents, Luther and Flossie Arnold, are not wealthy. The family is traveling to visit one of Geraldine's great aunts when they encounter Kathryn Kelly. Kathryn, the wife of George Machine Gun Kelly, offers the family a ride in her truck. She initially introduces herself as Miss Montgomery and appears friendly, but soon admits her real identity. Kathryn asks Luther to help her find a lawyer for her parents, who have been arrested. Luther agrees. Kathryn then continues towards San Antonio with Flossie and Geraldine. In San Antonio, Geraldine meets George, Machine Gun Kelly, for the first time. George and Kathryn are already wanted in connection with the kidnapping of oilman Charles Urschel, and investigators are beginning to close in on them. What began as a roadside encounter with a seemingly helpful woman has brought the Arnold family into the company of two wanted kidnappers. On September 11, 1933, the Kellys prepare to leave San Antonio. Kathryn believes the police will be searching for a man and a woman traveling together, but a husband, wife, and child will attract less suspicion. She tells Flossie that Geraldine will only travel with them as far as Coleman, Texas, and promises that the girl will be back in San Antonio by 4 o'clock that afternoon. Geraldine believes she will be home within just a few hours. She does not understand that the Kellys intend to take her farther than Coleman or use her presence to make themselves appear like an ordinary family. Once they break their promise and continue north, Geraldine's only desire is to escape the dangers surrounding the Kellys, return to her parents, and resume her normal life. When the Kellys and Geraldine reach Coleman, Texas, a woman warns Kathryn that officers have already been looking for her Ford pickup. The Kellys quickly change automobiles. Instead of returning Geraldine to her mother as promised, they continue north towards Chicago. As they travel, Kathryn dyes George's hair and wears a wig to disguise herself. Geraldine is now trapped with two fugitives desperately trying to avoid capture. In Chicago, they stay at the Astor Apartments. George makes frantic phone calls while Kathryn hurriedly writes letters. Geraldine is told to place stamps on the envelopes addressed to Charles Urschel, Judge Edgar Vaught, Joseph Keenan, and attorney Herbert Hyde. Geraldine overhears the Kellys discussing the people receiving the letters and talking about killing them. They also say they should have taken Urschel to Arizona, killed him, and buried him there. Frightened by what she hears, Geraldine repeatedly asks to go home. Kathryn assures her that she will not be harmed and buys her two dresses because she has no other clothing with her. One of them becomes the nicest dress that Geraldine owns. From Chicago, the group travels to Memphis in a new Chevrolet supplied by an associate named Joe Burgle, who also gives the Kellys $200 and a quart of whiskey. George considers returning to Coleman, Texas to recover ransom money buried at Cass Coleman's farm, but changes his mind. Instead, Geraldine and a man named Langford Ramsey are supposed to meet another person, collect the money, and carry it back to the Kellys. Kathryn also wants them to retrieve her furs for a planned return to Chicago. What Geraldine believed would be a short trip to Coleman has become a 2-week flight across several states, and now she is being drawn deeper into the Kellys' efforts to escape and recover their money. Eventually, Geraldine is placed aboard a train in Fort Worth bound for Oklahoma City. After approximately 2 weeks in the company of the Kellys, she is finally traveling away from them. But when she arrives in Oklahoma, she discovers that her parents have been arrested. Returning home does not immediately restore the ordinary family life she wanted. Geraldine meets with agents from the Bureau of Investigation and tells them what she has heard and seen. Her knowledge of the Kellys' movements, conversations, and associates became valuable to the investigation. According to the account she later gives on stage, and helps authorities locate George and Kathryn Kelly at their hiding place in Tennessee. The child the Kellys used to conceal themselves has become one of the people who helps expose them. By the time Geraldine's story begins circulating nationally, George and Kathryn Kelly are serving life sentences in federal prison. Geraldine, meanwhile, is no longer known only as a schoolgirl who disappeared with them. Entertainment agent Kay Lee Williams organizes a tour of 20 Oklahoma theaters featuring her story. Her 10-minute presentation is titled My Experience in the Hands of the Kellys. It is paired with screenings of Sucker Money, a motion picture about grifters who kidnap a woman and hold her for ransom. The film's subject makes it a calculated companion to Geraldine's real experience. Audiences listened closely as Geraldine described traveling across the country with fugitives. Some audience members reportedly cry as they imagine what the 13-year-old girl endured. At the end of the presentation, Geraldine thanks J. Edgar Hoover and the Bureau of Investigation before her parents join her on stage. Luther and Flossie distribute handbills bearing their daughter's photograph beneath the words, "Girl Nemesis of the Kellys." Audience members only have a short time to receive her autograph before the next motion picture begins. Newspapers and magazines carry her story across country, reaching hundreds of thousands of readers, including George and Kathryn Kelly, inside federal prison. Geraldine finished her speech as her parents joined her beneath the theater lights. The Kellys had taken her because they believed a child would help them disappear. Instead, the girl that they used as camouflage remembered everything, helped expose them, and stood before packed theaters telling the country exactly who they were.
Babyface Nelson walked through 17 gunshot wounds, stole the FBI car belonging to the man who shot him, and disappeared into the Chicago suburbs. By the time police found him, 2 federal agents were dead and Nelson's body had been wrapped in an Indian pattern blanket and dumped beside a cemetery. How did a routine sighting on a Wisconsin highway become one of the deadliest gunfights in FBI history? By November 1934, the age of the famous Depression-era bank robber was beginning to collapse. John Dillinger had been killed outside Chicago 4 months earlier, and many of the men who rode with him were either dead, in prison, or hiding. But Lester Gillis, better known as Babyface Nelson, was still free. Despite his youthful face and small frame, Nelson had earned the reputation as one of the most violent fugitives in America. He had robbed banks with the members of the Dillinger gang, but his reckless temper made him dangerous even to his own partners. Now the FBI was concentrating its resources on finding him. On the afternoon of November 27th, Nelson was traveling through southern Wisconsin with his wife, Helen Gillis, and longtime partner John Paul Chase. They were headed toward the Chicago area when 2 federal agents conducting surveillance near Lake Geneva recognized him. Within minutes, Nelson's location and direction of travel were being passed to agents across the region. Nelson did not know it, but several FBI cars were already moving onto the highways ahead of him. Nelson's goal is no longer to rob another bank or build a new gang. He simply needed to reach Chicago without being captured. The city and its suburbs offered places to hide, people he trusted, and enough crowded roads to make surveillance difficult. If Nelson, Helen Gillis, and John Chase could get past the agents searching the highways, they might disappear into the city before the FBI could organize a larger search. Inspector Samuel Calley wanted the opposite. Calley had been sent to Chicago to direct the hunt for Nelson, and the report from Lake Geneva gave him the opportunity he had been waiting for. Nelson had been identified, his license plate was known, and he had appeared to be traveling south. Calley immediately sent agents Bill Ryan and Tom McDade onto the highway. He then left with agent Herman Hollis in a second car. Nelson was racing toward Chicago. Calley was trying to close the road before he reached it. At approximately 3:15 that afternoon, agents Bill Ryan and Tom McDade spotted Nelson's car traveling south toward Chicago. They turned around and began to follow him, expecting the fugitive to accelerate and attempt escape. Instead, Nelson turned his car around. He passed agents, made another turn, and came up behind him. The men who had been sent to pursue Babyface Nelson were suddenly being hunted by him. Gunfire erupted between the moving cars. Nelson and John Chase carried more powerful weapons and quickly filled agents' vehicles with bullets. Ryan and McDade were badly outgunned, but Ryan managed to fire a shot into Nelson's radiator. Steam began rising from the front of the fugitive's car. The damaged engine lost power, forcing Nelson to slow down as the agents raced ahead. Nelson had avoided capture, but his route to Chicago was disappearing. His car was failing, federal agents knew exactly where he was, and another FBI vehicle was approaching from the opposite direction. Moments later, Inspector Samuel Calley and Agent Herman Hollis passed Nelson's damaged car on the highway. Hollis immediately turned around and followed. By then, Nelson's radiator had been pierced and his car could go on no further. He pulled off the road near Barrington, Illinois. The chase was over, but Nelson was not preparing to surrender. He and John Chase stepped from the disabled car, carrying their weapons, and took positions beside the road. Helen Gillis remained nearby as the FBI vehicle approached. Hollis brought the car to a sliding stop roughly 150 feet behind them. Before the agents could fully take cover, Nelson and Chase opened fire. Hollis and Calley jumped from their vehicle and returned fire across the open roadside. Agent Hollis was struck and killed. Calley was mortally wounded. Nelson was also hit repeatedly, but instead of falling back, he moved forward through the gunfire toward the agent's car. That decision changed everything. Nelson had begun the afternoon trying to escape the FBI. Now badly wounded and with his own car disabled, he was advancing directly toward the men sent to capture him. Despite his wounds, Nelson reached the FBI vehicle. Helen Gillis and John Chase helped him inside, and the three escaped from the roadside in the car belonging to the agents who had been sent to capture them. For a few hours, Nelson had apparently survived the confrontation. He had broken through the FBI's line, left two agents behind, and disappeared into the northern suburbs of Chicago. Nelson was bleeding heavily from multiple gunshot wounds. Helen and Chase could not take him to the hospital without exposing themselves, and there was little they could do to save him. At approximately 8 o'clock into the evening, Babyface Nelson died in Wilmette only a few hours after leaving the battlefield at Barrington. Inspector Sam Calley remained alive through the night, but died at 2:17 the following morning. Agent Herman Hollis had died at the scene. The man who escaped one of the most violent gun battles in FBI history had gained only a few additional hours of freedom. Within a month, Helen Gillis and John Chase were both captured. Nelson was dead, his partners were in custody, and the gang that had terrorized banks and lawmen across the Midwest no longer existed. The following afternoon, police found Babyface Nelson's body lying in a ditch near a cemetery. He had been wrapped in an Indian pattern blanket before Helen Gillis and John Chase left him there. Helen later explained why she covered her husband's body. He always hated the cold. It was a strangely human final gesture after an afternoon of extraordinary violence. Nelson killed Agent Herman Hollis, mortally wounded Inspector Samuel Cowley, stolen their car, and escaped the battlefield. By the time Helen had wrapped the blanket around him, the man once feared across the country could no longer run. The highway had ended Babyface Nelson's criminal career. Helen's final act was simply to make sure Gillis would not be left alone in the cold.
Before she became the wife of Machine Gun Kelly, Kathryn Kelly had already lived several different lives. She married at 14, became a mother at 15, buried her third husband, traveled with bootleggers, and learned how early money could open doors in the criminal underworld. By the time she met George Kelly, she was not an innocent woman being introduced to crime by a dangerous man. She already knew the roads, the speakeasies, and the people who made their living outside the law. How did a girl born Lara Cleo Brooks become one of the most notorious women of the Great Depression era underworld? Kathryn was born Lara Cleo Brooks in Tupelo, Mississippi on March 18, 1904. When she was 6, her family moved to Texas, where her parents operated boarding houses and worked in grocery stores. Kathryn enjoyed music and learned to play the piano, but she found public school boring. After completing the 8th grade, she left school and soon met 17-year-old Lonnie Fry, whose family owned a farm near Shawnee, Oklahoma. On November 29, 1918, 14-year-old Kathryn married Lonnie in Asher, Oklahoma. Their daughter, Pauline Elizabeth, was born the following June. Kathryn was only 15 years old, and she was already a wife and a mother. The marriage lasted approximately 2.5 years. After the divorce, Kathryn and Pauline returned to live with her parents. 16 months later, Kathryn married Lenny Elbert Brewer. That marriage also ended in divorce in 1924. By the age of 20, Kathryn had already been married and divorced twice. In March 1927, 23-year-old Kathryn married her third husband, Charles Thorne. Thorne owned the American Cafe in Coleman, Texas, and had possessed more than 150 acres of ranch land. He also made money transporting illegal alcohol. For Kathryn, the marriage offered her something earlier life had not: money, travel, excitement, and access to expensive jewelry and clothing. Kathryn wanted more than the quiet life available to her in her small town Texas. She enjoyed fine hotels, stylish clothing, jewelry, automobiles, and the attention that came with it. She also discovered that she enjoyed the excitement of transporting illegal liquor. Kathryn began accompanying Thorne on his bootlegging runs. Together they traveled between towns, speakeasies, and distribution points. Some journeys reportedly took them as far as Canada, where grain alcohol was acquired before being transported south and converted into different kinds of illegal liquor. The work was dangerous, but it was profitable. It also gave Kathryn the feeling that she was escaping the ordinary life that had once bored her. She recognized, however, that the bootlegging world was not a great place for her daughter. Kathryn left Pauline in the care of her mother, Ora, while she continued traveling with Thorne. Kathryn wanted excitement and independence, but pursuing that life meant leaving motherhood and domestic stability behind. Kathryn and Thorne's marriage became increasingly volatile. Both accused one another of flirting with customers at the cafe. Kathryn suspected her husband of being unfaithful, and people around Coleman reportedly heard her threatening to kill him if she ever caught him cheating. Kathryn later claimed that Thorne also threatened her, especially while drinking. She described him as a heavy drinker who could consume enormous amounts of whiskey. On April 29, 1928, after drinking throughout the day, Thorne reportedly pointed his pistol at Kathryn and announced that he intended to kill her. Exhausted by the argument, she told him to just go ahead. Instead, Thorne put the weapon away. Kathryn went into the kitchen to wash the dinner dishes. A short time later, she heard a gunshot. She found Thorne on the bedroom floor with a wound to his head. He remained alive long enough to be transported to a hospital but died shortly after midnight. Authorities record a suicide note. Thorne stated that no one would be responsible for his death. Investigators verified that the note had been written by him, found nothing suspicious, and did not hold an inquest. But the official conclusion did not stop the rumors. Some Coleman residents remembered hearing Kathryn's threats against her husband. Others questioned how quickly he had been buried or claimed that he could not have written that note. There were even rumors that Kathryn was involved with the coroner. None of those suspicions were proven, but the gossip became so intense that Kathryn left Coleman and returned to her mother and stepfather's farm near Paradise, Texas. She had escaped prosecution, but she could not escape the reputation forming around her. Thorne's death gave Kathryn means to reinvent herself. She sold the property, timberland, and the cafe. With the money, she purchased a car, assembled a new wardrobe, stayed in expensive hotels, and traveled between Oklahoma City and Fort Worth. She worked for a time as a manicurist, but the nightlife surrounding her was far more important than the occupation. Kathryn spent her evenings in jazz clubs, speakeasies, and other establishments frequented by bootleggers and the underworld figures. She also continued attracting police attention. In Oklahoma City, Kathryn was suspected of helping lure a jewelry salesman to a remote location where two men beat and robbed him. She was arrested as an accessory but released because investigators lacked the evidence. In November 1929, she was arrested for shoplifting in Fort Worth and gave police the name Dolores Whitney. That charge was eventually dropped. Each encounter taught Kathryn something important. She learned how to use aliases, how to remain silent, and how difficult it could be for authorities to make accusations stick without evidence. Her family was already connected to a bootlegging trade. Her mother, Ora, and stepfather, Robert Boss Shannon, transported and manufactured illegal liquor from their farm near Paradise. Shannon also allowed fugitives to hide on the property for a price. Kathryn, therefore, had more than underworld acquaintances. She had access to a family refuge where criminals could disappear when a job went wrong. By 1930, she was romantically involved with bootlegger Stephen, Little Steve, Stevens. Kathryn was no longer standing at the edge of the criminal world. She had become part of it. During the summer of 1930, Kathryn and Little Steve were spending an evening at a fashionable supper club in Fort Worth. Kathryn arrived wearing a fitted silk gown, diamond jewelry, and a fur cape. While the couple ate and spoke with the people they knew, they encountered another bootlegger named George Kelly. Kelly had recently been released from the Leavenworth Penitentiary after serving time for violating liquor laws. He was already known as an experienced smuggler and an exceptional driver. It was not the first time that Kathryn had seen him. While Kelly was imprisoned at Leavenworth, Kathryn had visited a family member at the penitentiary. The two were introduced and exchanged several letters afterward, although the correspondence eventually ended. Now they were meeting again. Little Steve already knew Kelly and believed he might be useful to his growing bootleg operation. He suggested that the two men later meet to discuss working together. Before they separated, Kelly looked towards Kathryn. She returned his attention. It appeared to be nothing more than a brief exchange between two people who had met before. But Kathryn had spent years preparing herself for this moment. She understood bootlegging, knew how to move through the underworld, and had family connections that could shelter criminals from the law. George Kelly entered Kathryn's life, but crime had arrived long before he did.
At around 10 o'clock one morning in 1930, two bank robbers serving 25-year sentences walked up to the front gate of Leavenworth Penitentiary. They handed a new guard official passes bearing their photographs, and he let them leave. The documents were forged, and the prisoners suspected of helping create them worked inside Leavenworth's records and photography departments. His name was George Kelly. 4 months later, Kelly was free and meeting the men escaped inside a St. Paul speakeasy. 5 days after the meeting, armed robbers escaped from a Minnesota bank with more than $100,000, and Kelly was suspected of being one of them. How did a bootlegger sent to Leavenworth emerge on the path of becoming Machine Gun Kelly? In January 1928, George Kelly was not yet the nationally feared criminal newspapers would call Machine Gun Kelly. He was a successful bootlegger who had spent years transporting illegal liquor, bribing officials, and talking his way out of trouble. Each time he escaped serious punishment, he became more convinced that charm, money, and the right connections could protect him. That confidence finally failed him in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Police arrested Kelly at the home of his bootlegging partner, Little Steve Stevens, and Stevens' former wife, Bess. Kelly was already wanted for failing to appear in a court on a liquor charge. All three were convicted of violating the National Prohibition Act. Bess was sent to a federal women's prison in West Virginia, while Kelly and Little Steve received 3-year sentences at Leavenworth Penitentiary. Leavenworth was the largest maximum security federal prison in the country. Its 40-foot walls surrounded more than 1,500 inmates, including experienced bank and train robbers such as Thomas Holden, Francis Keating, and Vern Miller. Kelly listened closely to their stories and questioned them about how robberies were planned and why criminals were caught. He was eventually assigned to the prison's records and photography departments, placing him near inmate photographs, identification files, and the paperwork used by prisoners authorized to work outside the walls. Kelly did not want to leave Leavenworth and return to being an ordinary liquor runner. He wanted the knowledge, connections, and reputation needed to move into more profitable crime. More importantly, he looked for ways to make himself useful to the men he admired. His position in the records and photography departments gave him access most prisoners did not have. Thomas Holden and Francis Keating were each serving 25-year sentences. If Kelly helped him escape, he could prove that he was more than an admirer. He would become someone hardened criminals could trust and might remember after his release. Helping Holden and Keating escape Leavenworth would require more than slipping past a careless guard. Anyone caught assisting them could lose his own chance of freedom. The two men needed official-looking outside work passes bearing photographs convincing enough to survive inspection at the main gate. Those materials were normally kept inside the same records and photography departments where Kelly worked. That placed him in a dangerous position. He may have had the access they needed, but using it would leave evidence pointing directly toward him. Kelly was already nearing the end of his sentence. Helping two convicted bank robbers could earn their trust or keep him behind those walls for years longer. Around 10 o'clock one morning, Holding and Keating put on heavy prison work coats and approached Leavenworth's main gate. Each man carried an outside work pass bearing his photograph. A newly assigned guard examined the documents and allowed them to walk out. Their absence was not discovered until later that afternoon. Searchers found the discarded coats and forged passes about a half a mile from the prison. Investigators also learned that photographs from the records and photography departments had been used to create the documents. Suspicion immediately fell on Kelly. Officials could not prove that he helped produce the passes, but they removed him from both departments. The escape has succeeded. Holden and Keating were free, and investigators were correct. Kelly had demonstrated his value to criminals far more experienced than he was. 4 months after the escape, Kelly was released from Leavenworth and returned to Kansas City on July 10, 1930. He traveled to St. Paul and reunited with Holden and Keating at the Green Lantern Saloon. 5 days later, 5 armed men robbed the Bank of Wilmar in Minnesota and escaped with more than $100,000 in cash and bonds. The robbery was never officially solved, but Kelly was among the men suspected by participating. By September, he had joined Holden, Keating, and Vern Miller and Harvey Bailey in the robbery of the Untomwa Savings Bank in Iowa. The men Kelly had met inside Leavenworth were now his criminal partners outside it. George Kelly entered Leavenworth as a bootlegger. He left with experienced bank robbers as associates and a far more ambitious criminal future ahead of him. The prison intended to end his criminal career may have been the place where Machine Gun Kelly truly began.
For weeks in 1933, Clyde Barrow had to carry Bonnie Parker everywhere they went. Near Wellington, Texas, their speeding car struck a crossing where a bridge was out, overturned twice, and caught fire with Bonnie trapped underneath. Her right leg burned so badly that she could no longer walk. As Clyde fought through the flames, Bonnie begged him to shoot her if he could not pull her out. How did one wreck cripple Bonnie Parker and force Clyde to keep her alive while the law closed in? On June 10, 1933, Bonnie Parker is riding across West Texas with Clyde Barrow and W.D. Jones. They are heading towards Eric, Oklahoma to meet Clyde's brother, Buck, and his wife, Blanche. Bonnie and Clyde are living almost entirely on the road, unable to remain anywhere for long without risking discovery. Their automobile allows them to cross state lines and stay ahead of the officers searching for them. Clyde is accustomed to driving fast, and his sister Nell later writes that he always drove like a devil. The family account estimates that he is traveling about 70 miles per hour when he approaches the crossing near Wellington. A bridge is out, but Clyde sees danger a little too late. The car strikes the broken crossing, overturns twice, and rolls into a ditch. Clyde is thrown clear. Bonnie remains pinned beneath the wreck. The trip to Oklahoma no longer matters. Clyde's only concern is getting Bonnie out alive. Flames spread through the automobile as him and WD pull at the wreck, but they cannot lift it. Bonnie's right leg is trapped beneath the car and exposed directly to the fire. The pain becomes so severe that she begs the men to shoot her if they cannot free her. Clyde repeatedly runs into the flames, pulling at the automobile and shouting for help. Once Bonnie is free, his desire becomes even larger. He must find a way to keep her alive. Two farmers rush to the ditch and help raise the automobile high enough to pull Bonnie out. Her face and arms are burned, but her right leg has taken the worst of the fire. The men carry her to the nearby Pritchard farmhouse where Miss Pritchard treats the lesser burns but refuses to touch the leg because the injury is just too severe. Bonnie needs a doctor and an ambulance immediately, but she and Clyde beg the family not to call one. A hospital might save her life, but it would also bring police and almost certain capture. Their car is burning, Bonnie cannot walk, and they have no way to leave. While Clyde returns to the wreck for their weapons, one farmer slips away to contact officers. WD panics and fires when a door opens, severely injuring a woman entering the farmhouse. When officers arrive, Clyde and WD overpower them, take their automobile, and carry Bonnie into the back seat. They escape Wellington, but Bonnie is still badly burned and without proper treatment. Every doctor, nurse, or hospital they approach could reveal where they are. Clyde drives Bonnie to Fort Smith, Arkansas, rents a tourist cabin, and claims that his wife was burned in an oil stove explosion. A physician says she must enter a hospital immediately or be placed under a nurse's care. A hospital remains too dangerous, so Clyde hires the nurse. For the next week, he stays beside Bonnie, lifting her, adjusting her pillows, and trying to persuade her to eat while she calls for her mother in delirium. A second doctor is brought in, but neither physician offers much hope that she will survive. 9 days after the accident, Clyde risks returning to Dallas. Bonnie's mother and Clyde's mother want to go with him, but he believes officers are watching them. Instead, he brings Bonnie's younger sister back to Fort Smith. Bonnie does not recognize Billy at first, but on the third day, she finally knows her sister and begins to improve. Bonnie can no longer travel without assistance, and Clyde becomes responsible for carrying her, treating her injuries, and keeping her alive. Bonnie survives, but she is left crippled by the accident. By the middle of July, she is strong enough to travel again, but she still cannot walk. Her right leg is drawn beneath her by a burnt ligament, and Clyde must lift her from the automobile whenever they stop. For weeks, she rarely leaves the car unless someone carries her. Clyde changes her dressings and searches for medicine while the wound begins to heal and breaks open again. When Bonnie's family sees her in September, she is still using crutches and must be helped into and out of the car. According to the family's account, it takes about 7 months before she can walk normally again. The incident does not end their life on the road, but every journey, hiding place, and escape must now be arranged around Bonnie's. Before Wellington, Bonnie could sit beside Clyde as they crossed the country. After Wellington, she spent weeks confined to the automobile, unable to leave it unless Clyde lifted her out. The bridge did not end their flight from the law, but it took away Bonnie's independence. For weeks afterward, every time the car stopped, Clyde had to open the door, reach inside, and carry Bonnie with him.
One bullet tore through Clyde Barrow's knee and continued into Bonnie Parker's. Their mother's automobile was less than 10 feet away, directly in the line of fire. Bonnie smashed out the rear window and raised her weapon, but according to her family, she hesitated because one careless shot might kill her own mother. How did a secret family reunion become an ambush that nearly ended Bonnie and Clyde 6 months before their deaths? On November 21st, 1933, Clyde Barrow's mother celebrated her birthday. The Barrow and Parker family spent the day with Clyde and Bonnie in Wise County near the Shannon family farm. Meetings like this were among the few pieces of normal life the fugitives had left. They lived in automobiles, slept wherever they could avoid recognition, and never knew who might report them. The families arranged to meet again the following evening at a familiar location near Sowers, west of Dallas. It was the first, last, and only time the family used the same meeting place twice. Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, and members of Clyde's family reached the site around dusk. Their automobiles were parked on the side of the road about 70 feet from the highway. The road was curved downhill toward a small bridge, allowing a fleeing car to disappear from view within seconds. They did not know Sheriff Smooth Schmidt and his officers were concealed in a nearby gully, only about 30 feet away. Clyde and Bonnie were not arriving to rob a bank or escape a posse. They wanted to see their families. As their coupe passed along the highway, Clyde recognized the waiting automobile, but felt something wrong. According to the family account, he asked Bonnie what she thought and told her the situation seemed phony. They continued down the highway. When no one followed, Clyde circled back, entered the side road, passed the family, and began turning around so that he could park beside them. The relatives misunderstood, believing Clyde wanted them to follow. They switched on their headlights. The light outlined the automobile and gave the hidden officers a clear target. The family first mistook the sound for firecrackers. Then they saw muzzle flashes erupting from the ditch. According to the book Fugitives, no officer called for Clyde to stop and no warning was given. Gunfire tore into the couple as Clyde was turning. He pressed the accelerator and raced toward the bridge. Bonnie knocked out the rear window with a gun. Then she heard the woman screaming behind them. Her mother and Clyde's mother were directly in the line of fire. Bonnie repeatedly told Clyde she did not dare shoot because she might hit her own mother. Clyde warned that more officers might be waiting along the road and told her to fire toward the ditches. The left tire was shot away. Another bullet punctured the spare. Then a bullet entered Clyde's knee and continued into Bonnie's. Both later claimed they felt the impact but experienced no immediate pain and did not realize they had been wounded. As the car bounced toward the bridge, Clyde told Bonnie to pray because he believed this might be their last ride together. No second barrage came when they reached the bridge. Clyde kept the damaged coupe moving for 4 miles until it reached another highway. The officers did not immediately pursue because their automobiles had been parked nearly a mile away. Clyde and Bonnie stopped 2 men driving an old Ford and ordered them out. When the owner resisted, Clyde fired through his hat without striking his head. Bonnie climbed behind the wheel but could not find the ignition switch. The owner refused to help until Bonnie told Clyde he might have to shoot him for real. The man quickly showed her how to start the car. The Ford had no windows. Their coats and blankets remained inside the abandoned coupe. As they drove through the cold, neither understood how badly they had been hit. They stopped near a country gate. Clyde stepped out and collapsed. Bonnie tried to help him and also fell. They crawled back into the car, confused because neither wound caused the pain they expected. At a filling station, the attendant stared at the running board while adding gasoline. Bonnie leaned over to see what had caught his attention. Blood was flowing from beneath the door. Only then did they understand why they were becoming weak. Clyde drove toward Oklahoma, where they received medical treatment and stole another automobile with windows. By November 28th, they were back in Dallas, but Clyde had not returned merely to visit his family. He wanted revenge. Clyde blamed Sheriff Smith for opening fire, while both mothers sat in a line of bullets. He searched for Smith's home address and waited outside his residence until 3 in the morning and watched for Officer Bob Alcorn. He also studied the Dallas County Jail while considering whether he could rescue W.D. Jones. Clyde's sister Nell finally persuaded him to stop. She argued that another killing would worsen his legal position. He no longer cared. Instead, she warned that retaliation could pull the family deeper into violence and place more innocent people in danger. The Sowers ambush did not end with an arrest or a body beside the road. Bonnie and Clyde escaped, but one bullet had passed through both of them. Their mothers had watched helplessly, and Clyde came away willing to hunt the officers responsible. 6 months later, another group of lawmen would wait beside a rural road. That time, Clyde's instincts would not save them.
Bonnie Parker walked into the Waco jail with a pistol hidden beneath her dress. The jailer reminded her that she had already visited Clyde Barrow once that day and warned that she could not stay long if he allowed her upstairs again. One touch could expose the weapon. Bonnie backed away whenever he came close, pleading for one more final minute with Clyde, and delivered the gun that allowed 3 prisoners to walk out of the jail. How did an ordinary visit become the moment Bonnie crossed the line from Clyde Barrow's girlfriend to his accomplice? In March 1930, Clyde Barrow was being held inside the county jail in Waco, Texas. He was a young thief facing a lengthy prison sentence and expecting to enter the Texas prison system. Bonnie moved into the Waco home of her married cousin, identified in the book as Mary. From there, she visited Clyde every day and sometimes twice a day, writing letters that promised she would wait for him. One of the prisoners being held with Clyde was William Turner, whose family lived in East Waco. Turner knew that a gun was concealed somewhere inside of his family's home. His mother and sister worked during the day, but he refused to ask either woman to retrieve it because they might be caught. Turner believed that Bonnie might take the risk for Clyde. Turner drew Bonnie a map showing her where to find the house key, the gun, and its ammunition. Recovering the weapon was only half of the plan. Bonnie would then have to carry it inside the jail and place it in Clyde's hands without being searched. Mary drove with her to East Waco, but believed they were retrieving clothing for Turner. When they reached the empty house, Bonnie had found the key and went inside. Only then did she tell Mary the truth. They were searching for a gun so Clyde could escape from jail. Mary immediately wanted to leave. She imagined officers surrounding the house and waiting to arrest them. Her feet felt like ice and her knees like water. Bonnie refused to leave without the weapon. The problem was that Turner's map was wrong. The gun was not where he said it would be. Bonnie began searching, and when Mary realized she could not persuade her to stop, she joined in because finding the gun seemed like the quickest way out. They turned the house upside down before discovering the weapon inside of a window seat. Newspapers later reported that the Turner home had been ransacked. The family apparently did not report the gun missing because they had not known it was hidden there. Bonnie now possessed the weapon, but she still had to carry it past the jailer. She fastened one belt beneath her dress to hold up her slip against her body. A second belt created a pocket capable of securing the pistol beneath her clothing. Mary spent the drive back believing that every person they passed somehow knew what they were carrying. At the jail, the jailer hesitated when Bonnie asked to see Clyde. He reminded her that she had already visited once that day and warned that she could not remain upstairs for long. Bonnie continually backed away as they spoke, afraid he might touch her and feel the gun beneath her dress. She pleaded for 1 minute with Clyde and promised that she would not bother the jailer again for a long time. The promise was more truthful than he understood. If Bonnie delivered the weapon, Clyde would no longer be there for her to visit. The jailer allowed her upstairs. Mary remained below, sweating as though it were summer and waiting for someone to discover what they had done. The book does not explain how Bonnie transferred the gun or what she said to Clyde. It only says that she eventually returned downstairs. The two women left immediately. They drove home, locked the doors, pulled down the shades, and waited. Clyde might be shot during the escape. He might shoot an officer and face execution or life imprisonment. Bonnie and Mary stayed awake throughout the night, unable to learn whether the pistol had freed him or killed him. At daybreak, Bonnie sent Mary for a newspaper. The headline gave them their answer. Clyde Barrow, Emery Abernathy, and William Turner had walked out of the jail and disappeared. Nothing was reported about where they had obtained the gun. Bonnie began to cry. She then wiped her face and told Mary they should eat some breakfast. The escape occurred on March 11, 1930. Clyde's freedom lasted 1 week. On March 18th, authorities captured Clyde, Turner, and Abernathy in Ohio after they robbed a dry cleaning establishment and offices belonging to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They refused to provide their names, but investigators identified them through their fingerprints. The three were returned to Waco. According to the book, Clyde's entire 14-year sentence was imposed. On April 21st, he was transferred to Huntsville and entered the Texas prison system. Bonnie had placed a gun inside the jail and given Clyde 7 days of freedom. The escape ended with him back in custody and facing the full 14-year sentence imposed against him. The officers apparently never learned where the gun came from. Bonnie's mother claimed she did not discover her daughter's role until after Bonnie was killed, when Mary finally revealed what had happened. Clyde Barrow's escape did not begin with a dynamite, machine gun, or an armed gang attacking the jail. It began with a hand-drawn map, an empty house, and 2 frightened women with a pistol beneath Bonnie Parker's dress. She entered the jail appearing to be nothing more than a young woman visiting the man she loved. By morning, 3 prisoners were gone, and Bonnie Parker had taken her first clear step from standing beside Clyde Barrow to actively helping him escape the law.
Federal agents came to the Little Bohemia Lodge to capture John Dillinger. They never laid a hand on him. Instead, their first gunfire killed an innocent man, the gang escaped through the back of the lodge, and babyface Nelson disappeared alone in the woods. 2 miles away, Nelson took over a house filled with hostages. When 2 federal agents and a local constable arrived, He walked toward their car, asked who they were, and opened fire. Before the night ended, Agent W. Carter Baum was dead and Nelson was escaping in a government automobile. How did a rush raid on Dillinger become the night babyface Nelson made himself one of the Bureau's most dangerous targets? On Friday, April 20th, 1934, Dillinger, Nelson, Homer Van Meter, John Hamilton, Tommy Carroll, and several companions arrived at the Little Bohemia near Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin. Nelson and his wife Helen stayed in a cottage beside the lodge, while Dillinger and several others occupied rooms in the main building. The remote resort appeared to offer a place to rest, but it remained open to the public. On Easter Sunday, about 75 customers came for dinner, while some of America's most wanted bank robbers remained on the property. That morning, Melvin Purvis, head of the Bureau's Chicago office, received a telephone tip from a local resident, Henry Voss, that Dillinger was there. By late afternoon, agents were flying toward northern Wisconsin, but they had little time to examine the ground, coordinate with local officers, or build a careful plan. Nelson's immediate goal was simple: leave the lodge before the agents could close the trap. After dark, the federal cars approached with their headlights off and agents began spreading across unfamiliar ground. The lodge's dogs barked as 3 customers climbed into a car and started toward the highway. With the radio playing, the heater running, and the windows closed, the men apparently did not hear orders to stop. Agents mistook them for gangsters and opened fire, killing civilian Conservation Corps worker Eugene Bossino and wounding John Morris and John Hoffman. The shots warned everybody inside. Nelson ran from his cottage toward the lodge while firing into the darkness. Agents fired back, but he reached the main building and slipped out behind it. Dillinger, Van Meter, and Hamilton moved away from the lodge in one direction, but Nelson fled south through the woods alone. His wife remained behind and would be captured. Nelson had escaped the immediate gunfire, but he was on foot in the cold northern darkness while federal agents searched the area. He reached the home of Paul and Minnie Lang and forced the couple to drive him away. The car soon failed near the home of Alvin Corner, the local telephone switchboard operator. Nelson entered with the Langes and took the Corner family hostage. More local men arrived and were detained as well. Nelson now had a full house of prisoners, but he did not have a reliable way out. Before Nelson entered the house, Corner had reported a suspicious car outside, back near Little Bohemia. Agents W. Carter Baum and J. Newman were sent to seek reinforcements and investigate reports of stolen or suspicious vehicles. Local constable Carl Christensen joined them. Their search led to Corner's home, where Nelson was preparing to leave with local men forced into a car. When the officers drove up, Christensen recognized the automobile as belonging to a resident. Nelson approached and asked the 3 men who they were. They identified themselves. Nelson drew an automatic pistol, ordered them out, and began firing. Newman was struck in the head and lost consciousness. Baum was killed. Christensen was hit repeatedly and left gravely wounded. Nelson took the government car and escaped, but the vehicle later suffered a flat tire and became trapped in soft ground. He abandoned it and returned to the woods. He eventually appeared at the secluded home of Old Catfish, a member of the Lac du Flambeau band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and held the family under threat for about 3 days. When their food was gone, Nelson made Catfish walk with him until they found another automobile. He stole it, drove west, released Catfish, and finally escaped the region. Back at Little Bohemia, Helen Gillis and the 2 other women were captured, but every male member of the gang had gotten away. The raid ended with 2 deaths, several wounded officers and civilians, and no arrested gunmen. Little Bohemia is usually remembered as the night John Dillinger escaped, but babyface Nelson left the bloodiest trail. The Bureau issued an identification order seeking him for Baum's murder and made his capture a priority. Several months later, Nelson killed 2 more federal agents during the gun battle that also ended his own life. His nickname and youthful appearance made him easy for newspapers to package as another colorful Depression-era outlaw, but the people left behind at Little Bohemia tell a different story. Civilians mistaken for criminals, families held at gunpoint, a constable nearly killed, and Carter and Baum never returning home. Nelson escaped Wisconsin, but he left Little Bohemia as something more dangerous than Dillinger's associate. He left as a killer the Bureau would not stop hunting.
Bonnie Parker was standing in her house slippers and negligee, preparing to take a pot of red beans from the stove, when Clyde Barrow shouted that the law was outside. Blanche Barrow was playing solitaire, Buck was asleep on the couch, and Blanche's little white dog was lying at her feet. Minutes later, 2 officers were dead, 3 members of the gang were wounded, and Blanche was running down the street carrying her dog and a deck of cards. Bonnie and Clyde escaped, but what they left inside that house would expose their identities and create the image of Bonnie Parker that America would never forget. How did a quiet family reunion become the Joplin gun battle that transformed Bonnie and Clyde into national fugitives? Buck Barrow had recently decided to find his younger brother Clyde, whom he had not seen in 2 years. Buck insisted that he only wanted to visit and promised his sister Nell that he would never travel with Clyde or become involved in his crimes. Blanche did not believe that it would be that simple. She had never been in trouble with the law, was terrified of guns and bloodshed, and had cried for 2 days before leaving with Buck. The couple eventually met Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones outside of Fort Smith, Arkansas. The five traveled to Joplin, Missouri, where they rented a house in the suburbs with living quarters above a double garage. For several weeks, their existence looked strangely ordinary. Bonnie cooked red beans and cabbage, Blanche played solitaire and cared for her white dog, Buck rested, and everyone read magazines and exchanged news from home. Bonnie wrote poetry while the women mended clothing, sent out laundry, and had the men's suits cleaned. For a short time, it resembled a family reunion, except Clyde was already wanted for several killings. The group wanted to remain together and enjoy the temporary safety of the Joplin house, but their combined money eventually fell to only $8. Clyde decided that he and WD would scout for a place to rob. He told Bonnie where he was going, but did not explain that plan to Buck. After reaching the car, Clyde returned upstairs and kissed Bonnie again, telling her that he hated leaving her. Bonnie laughed and assured him that she would still be there when he returned. Clyde explained that this was not what worried him. He had a feeling that something was about to happen. According to the family account, Clyde had not driven a dozen blocks before turning the car around. He told WD that he could sense danger in the air and abandoned the search for a robbery target. He drove back to the house, pulled into the garage, and locked the door. At almost that exact moment, officers arrived outside. Upstairs, Bonnie was preparing to remove the red beans from the stove and put cornbread in the oven. Blanche was still playing solitaire, her dog was asleep at her feet, and Buck was sleeping on the couch. Clyde shouted that the law had arrived, and the quiet reunion instantly collapsed into chaos. Bonnie later remembered the smell of her beans burning, Blanche screaming, the dog barking, and gunfire erupting around the house. According to Bonnie's account in the book, she grabbed a gun, ran to the window, and fired at a man running down the street, although she insisted that she did not hit him. Before she could fire again, a bullet passed through the upper part of the window and sent glass falling around her. Buck pushed her down and ordered her to move away from the opening. In the garage below, Clyde and WD fired their machine guns while Clyde shouted for Bonnie and Blanche to get in the back of the car. Blanche had already panicked. At the first shot, she opened the door and ran down the stairs, with her dog following behind her. Still dressed in her negligee and without stopping to put on ordinary clothes or shoes, Bonnie ran into the garage. Buck followed carrying a gun, although Bonnie said she did not remember seeing him fire it. Bullets struck the walls, doors, and windows around them. WD had been wounded in the head, and as Clyde attempted to enter the car, he noticed blood coming from his chest. Bonnie found a flattened bullet just beneath the skin, and with Clyde's help, removing it using her fingertips and a hairpin. Instead of immediately entering the car, Clyde moved around the corner of the garage and continued firing. Bonnie followed and begged him to leave, but Clyde refused until he had fired at the man who had wounded him. Meanwhile, the officer's automobiles was blocking the driveway. WD released its brakes and pushed it down the drive until it rolled across the street and struck a curb. A wounded officer was lying in the front of their own car, and Buck stopped WD from driving over him. Buck ran into the gunfire, grabbed the dying man out of the automobile's path, and returned to the car. Clyde finally ran back, took over the wheel, and drove out while he and WD continued firing from opposite sides. Bonnie directed Clyde toward the street where Blanche had disappeared. They found her 2 blocks away, still running and sobbing with her little white dog in her arms. She climbed into the back seat beside Bonnie, still clutching the deck of playing cards she had been using when the shooting began. Bonnie later said it took approximately 30 minutes to pry the cards from Blanche's hand. Clyde drives so quickly that the group reached Amarillo in less than 8 hours, where they purchased medicine for WD's wounds. They had escaped Joplin, but they had abandoned nearly everything inside of the house. Blanche's purse containing Buck's pardon and their marriage license, making identification easy. The group had also left several rolls of film. When the officers developed them, they discovered photographs of 4 of the 5 fugitives. One showed Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth and a gun resting against her hip. Other photographs showed gang members posing with a weapon taken from Officer Purcell during an earlier kidnapping. According to the book, the cigar photograph permanently branded Bonnie as Clyde Barrow's cigar smoking gun moll, even though the image had been posed. Officers in 3 states were now searching not only for Bonnie and Clyde, but also for Buck, Blanche, and an unidentified fifth man. W.D. Jones would later be traced through the photographs after his arrest. The Joplin escape had saved their lives, but the belongings they abandoned destroyed their anonymity and pulled Buck and Blanche completely into the manhunt. Before Joplin, Bonnie and Clyde were fugitives whose faces were still unfamiliar to much of the country. After Joplin, police possessed photographs, documents, names, and evidence connecting the entire group. The famous image of Bonnie with a cigar did not show the frightened woman who remembered burning beans, shattering glass, and bullets striking the walls around her. It created a character the newspapers could sell to the public. Bonnie and Clyde escaped the house, but they left behind photographs that would follow them for the rest of their lives.
A bank employee quietly pressed a hidden alarm as John Dillinger's gang took control of the Security National Bank in Sioux Falls. Outside, motorcycle officer Hale Keith ran toward the building, unaware that Babyface Nelson was watching him through a plate glass window. Nelson climbed onto the desk, raised his Thompson submachine gun, and opened fire. Keith collapsed in the street, and Nelson reportedly celebrated, believing he had killed him. But the officer lying motionless outside the bank was still alive. How did one silent alarm turn a carefully planned bank robbery into one of the clearest demonstrations of Babyface Nelson's willingness to kill? On the morning of March 6, 1934, John Dillinger had been free for only 3 days after escaping the supposedly secure jail at Crown Point, Indiana. He quickly joined a newly assembled gang that included Lester Gillis, better known as Babyface Nelson, and headed west towards Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Shortly before 10 o'clock, 6 men arrived outside the Security National Bank in a green Packard. 4 prepared to enter while 2 remained outside to control the street. Their Thompson submachine guns were concealed beneath long coats, and the brims of their hats were pulled low over their faces. One bank employee reportedly watched the Packard approaching and remarked that it looked exactly like a holdup car. Moments later, Dillinger and others walked through the doors, drew their weapons, and announced the robbery. The gang's objective was simple: seize as much cash as possible, control everyone inside the bank, and escape before local police could organize a response. A successful robbery depended on speed, discipline, and control. Employees had to be kept away from the telephones, customers had to remain still, and no one outside could be allowed to interfere with the getaway. Nelson had only recently joined Dillinger, Homer Van Meter, and others. The robbery would require him to follow their plan, remain under control, and avoid unnecessary violence. If every man performed his assigned role, the gang could collect the money and leave Sioux Falls before serious resistance developed. But the entire plan depended on silence, and one bank employee had already reached for the alarm. The plan began to unravel almost immediately. The hidden alarm alerted people outside the bank, and word of the robbery spread through downtown Sioux Falls. Curious residents gathered around the streets while police officers moved toward the building, turning the gang's quiet escape route into a crowded and increasingly dangerous scene. Motorcycle officer Hale Keith was among those who responded. He approached the bank without knowing exactly where the gunmen were positioned. While inside, Nelson watched the streets through the large plate glass windows. The gang now faced the problem Dillinger had hoped to avoid. They were trapped inside with employees and customers while armed police closed in outside. They still had the money, but every passing second gave authorities more time to block the streets, surround the Packard, and cut off their escape. For Nelson, however, the approaching officer was not simply an obstacle, he was a target. Nelson climbed onto a desk near the front window, raised his Thompson submachine gun, and fired through the plate glass at Hale Keith. Bullets struck the officer in the abdomen, arms, and leg, throwing him into the street. Keith rolled into the gutter and lay completely still, hoping the gunman would believe he was dead. Nelson reportedly shouted that he had gotten one of the officers, convinced the threat outside had been eliminated. The gunfire transformed the robbery. What had begun as a controlled attempt to seize money was now an armed confrontation in the middle of downtown Sioux Falls, with a wounded policeman lying outside, crowds watching from nearby buildings, and law enforcement converging on the bank. The gang could no longer slip away. To escape, they would have to cross the exposed street and use people inside as protection. With nearly $50,000 in stolen money, the gangsters surrounded themselves with employees and customers and marched from the bank behind a human shield. 5 bank employees were forced onto the Packard's running boards, preventing officers from firing without risking innocent lives. As the car raced downtown, police damaged its radiator, but the gang fired at pursuing vehicles and scattered roofing nails across the road. When the Packer began failing outside Sioux Falls, the robbers again used their hostages for protection, seized another automobile, and continued their escape. The hostages were released about 10 miles outside the city, and the gang eventually returned safely to the Twin Cities. Despite the gunfire, no one was killed. Hale Keith survived his wounds after remaining motionless in the gutter and allowing Nelson to believe he was dead. The alarm had failed to stop the robbery, but it revealed exactly what made Nelson different. When confronted with danger, his first instinct was not merely to escape, it was to kill. The Security National Bank robbery succeeded. Dillinger's gang escaped with nearly $50,000, crossed the city behind hostages, changed automobiles, and disappeared before authorities could stop them. Yet the moment people remembered was not the money. It was the sight of Hale Keith lying motionless in the gutter while Nelson left Sioux Falls believing he had killed him. The hidden alarm had summoned help exactly as intended, but it also placed one unsuspecting officer directly in Nelson's sights. Keith survived not because Nelson showed resistance, but because he convinced babyface Nelson that another killing had already been completed.
On April 27, 1933, Louisiana Undertaker Dillard Darby watched a stranger drive away from a Reston boarding house in his Ford. Darby and Sophia jumped into her car and chased the thief through the countryside, unaware that they were following a member of the Barrow gang. When they finally gave up and turned towards home, Bonnie and Clyde's gang came after them, forced them in the road, and took them hostage. During the ride, Bonnie repeatedly learned that Darby was an undertaker and joked that perhaps he would work on her body someday. 13 months later, Bonnie and Clyde were lying dead inside of a Louisiana funeral parlor, and Dillard Darby was called to help to prepare them. How did a stolen automobile connect Bonnie and Clyde with the man who would eventually handle their bodies? The kidnapping occurred only 2 weeks after the Joplin gun battle had transformed the Barrow gang into nationally recognizable fugitives. Clyde, Bonnie, Buck, Blanche, and W.D. Jones had escaped Missouri but left photographs, documents, and personal belongings behind, allowing newspapers across the country to publish their faces. According to a local Louisiana account, the gang spent part of April 27th watching the Reston State Bank before deciding that they needed another automobile. Dillard Darby's Ford was parked outside the Brooks boarding house on North Trenton Street. Darby was inside eating with his family when Sophia Stone, Lincoln Parish's home demonstration agent, saw a man enter the car. Darby ran outside and attempted to climb on the running board as the Ford pulled away, but he could not stop it. Stone offered the use of her car, and the two set off after the thief. Darby wanted only to recover his automobile. He and Stone followed the Ford north through the Dubach and toward Hico, but the stolen car gradually pulled away. Realizing that they could not catch it, they abandoned the pursuit and started back towards Reston. What they did not understand was that W.D. Jones had taken Darby's Ford while the remaining members of the gang traveled nearby in another vehicle. The gang could not know whether the people following Jones were the car's owners, witnesses, or officers attempting to track them. Clyde turned the gang's vehicle around and began chasing the two people who had been pursuing them. Darby and Stone had started the afternoon as pursuers, but within minutes, they were the ones attempting to escape. The account Clyde later gave his family made the encounter almost sound playful. He said the gang chased Darby and Stone for a lark, caught them, and never intended to hurt them. Darby's own statement described something considerably more violent. He said the gang stopped them and that when he approached their car, Clyde pointed a gun at him, demanded to know why he followed the stolen Ford, and struck him across the back of the head with a pistol. Stone was pulled from her car, struck, and forced into the gang's vehicle. With 7 people crowded inside and rifles, shotguns, pistols, and ammunition visible all around them, the captives listened as Clyde and Buck argued over whether they should be released or killed. Darby later said the gang blamed them for disrupting its plans and threatened them repeatedly as they traveled towards Arkansas. Clyde remembered the kidnapping as a joke, but Darby and Stone remembered believing that they might not survive the ride. The gang eventually decided to release Darby and Stone in southern Arkansas. Before leaving, one of the men threw down a $5 bill explaining that the captives had been carried farther from home than expected and would need money to contact the sheriff. Darby and Stone used the money to obtain transportation and report the kidnappings. They did not initially know the names of their captors, but after examining police photographs, they identified Bonnie Parker, Blanche Barrow, Clyde Barrow, and Buck Barrow. Later accounts claim that Bonnie had learned during the journey that Darby was an undertaker and suggested that perhaps he would be the person who worked on her after she died. The remark does not appear in Clyde's version of the kidnapping or in the surviving portion of Darby's original statement, so whether Bonnie actually said it cannot be proven. What happened 13 months later, however, made the story impossible to forget. On May 23, 1934, a Louisiana and Texas posse ambushed Bonnie and Clyde near Gippsland. Their bullet-riddled Ford was taken to the Conger Furniture Store and Funeral Parlor in Arcadia, where C.F. Bailey began the preliminary embalming in a preparation room behind the store. News of the death spread rapidly and thousands of people descended upon Arcadia. Crowds broke windows, damaged furniture, and continually filed past the bodies. The pressure became so great that the Undertaker struggled to complete his work while keeping the spectators from overturning the building. Dillard Darby and Sophia Stone came from nearby Ruston to identify the two people who had kidnapped them the previous year. Darby then remained at the funeral parlor and assisted Bailey in preparing both bodies. 13 months earlier, Dillard Darby had been sitting inside a crowded automobile, surrounded by weapons and wondering whether Bonnie and Clyde's gang would allow him to live. They released him with $5 and continued running, probably never expecting their paths to cross again. When Darby next saw them, the pursuit was over and the threats had fallen silent. In the back room of an Arcadia furniture store, the former prisoner helped prepare the bodies of the two fugitives who had once held his life in their hands.
On November 1st, 1932, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd walked into the Silsall State Bank in Oklahoma and began robbing it in broad daylight. There was little attempt to hide who he was. People in town had grown up with him, former classmates recognized him, and according to later local accounts, members of Floyd's own family even came into Silsall knowing what he intended to do. His 75-year-old grandfather reportedly positioned himself near the bank, hoping to watch his grandson carry out the robbery. How did one of America's most wanted outlaws return to his hometown, rob a bank surrounded by people who knew him, and still manage to escape? Charles Pretty Boy Floyd was no stranger to Silsall, Oklahoma. He had grown up in nearby Sackaway County, and many of the people living in and around the town had known him long before the newspapers began calling him one of the most dangerous outlaws in the country. By the fall of 1932, Floyd was already wanted for a series of robberies and had developed a reputation throughout Oklahoma as a bank robber who could disappear into the rural communities that knew him best. But returning to Silsall was different. This was familiar territory filled with former classmates, neighbors, and relatives who could recognize him immediately. Instead of avoiding the place where his identity would be obvious, Floyd chose the Silsall State Bank as his next target. Floyd's goal was to rob the Silsall State Bank quickly and leave town before local law enforcement could organize a response. He was accompanied by George Birdwell and at least one other man, but unlike many bank robberies, there was little secrecy surrounding their arrival. According to later local accounts, Floyd spoke with people he knew before the robbery and made no serious attempt to disguise himself. One story even places him at the barber shop next to the bank, where he reportedly asked the acquaintances not to use the telephone while he was inside. Whether every detail of those later recollections can be verified or not, contemporary reports confirm that several people in Silsall recognized Floyd during the robbery. He was attempting something unusually bold: rob a bank in a town where his face was already familiar and depend on speed, intimidation, and his knowledge of the area to get away. The greatest problem was that Floyd could not control who walked through the door. As the robbery continued, customers entered the bank and found themselves facing a man some of them had known for years. Contemporary reports said several witnesses recognized Floyd immediately, including people who had attended school with him. Each new arrival meant another person who could identify him and another chance for the word of the robbery to spread through town. According to later local accounts, friends and relatives were already nearby, and Floyd's 75-year-old grandfather had even come into Silsall hoping to see what happened. What had began as an unusually open robbery was becoming increasingly dangerous. Floyd might have been surrounded by familiar faces, but familiarity offered no protection once somebody raised the alarm. He and his companions now had to get themselves and the stolen money out of town before the Silsall could react. The situation changed when Floyd and his companions decided they had stayed long enough. They gathered approximately $2,530 from the bank and prepared to leave, but they did not go alone. Assistant cashier Bob Riggs was forced into the getaway car as a hostage, giving robbers some protection if anyone attempted to stop them as they fled through town. Within minutes, the robbery that had unfolded in front of people who personally knew Floyd was over. The car sped away from Sillisaw, and Riggs was released near the edge of town. By the time authorities could organize a response, Floyd and his companions had disappeared into the countryside they knew so well. The robbery succeeded, but there was never much mystery about who committed it. Contemporary reports says several people in Sillisaw identified Floyd, including residents who had known him since his school days. He and his companions escaped with roughly $2,530, and no one inside the bank was killed. What made the robbery memorable was not the amount of money taken, but the setting. Floyd had returned to the community where he had grown up, robbed a bank in front of people who recognized him immediately, and according to later local accounts, did it while friends and relatives gathered nearby to see what would happen. Instead of hiding from his past, Pretty Boy Floyd had walked directly back into it and still managed to escape.
Horace Grissow was struggling to open the safe inside of the New Carlisle National Bank when one of the armed men behind him reportedly suggested shooting him. Grissow was frightened, the robbers were growing impatient, and every second increased the chance that someone else would walk through the front door. But the man directing the robbery refused to let him be killed. His name was John Dillinger. Less than 6 weeks earlier, Dillinger had been released from prison, and this was the first bank robbery of the career that would soon make him one of the most hunted men in America. How did a recently paroled convict walk into a small Ohio bank and successfully begin the crime spree that created the Dillinger legend? John Dillinger had been out of prison for only a few weeks when he arrived in New Carlisle, Ohio, in June of 1933. He was 29 years old and had spent more than 8 years behind bars after taking part in a failed robbery in Indiana. During those years, Dillinger had lived among experienced bank robbers who talked openly about their methods, their mistakes, and the kind of planning required to make a robbery work. By the time he was paroled on May 10th, he had received an education in crime from men who had been doing it for years. But Dillinger himself had never successfully robbed a bank. Outside prison, he began associating with other criminals, including William Shaw, Paul Lefty Parker, and within weeks, he was ready to put in what he had learned into practice. The target they chose was the New Carlisle National Bank, a small town bank roughly 100 miles east of Indianapolis. Dillinger's goal was simple: get inside the bank before anyone knew a robbery was taking place, control the employees as they arrived, and leave with the money before the town had time to react. According to William Shaw, Dillinger had learned that a rear restroom window at the bank was often slightly left open. That small detail gave them a way inside without breaking a door or drawing attention. Late on June 20th, Dillinger, Shaw, Paul Lefty Parker, and Noble Claycomb drove from Indianapolis towards New Carlisle. They reached the town before daylight, found the window as expected, and climbed into the darkened bank. Claycomb remained with the getaway car while Dillinger and the others hid behind the counter and waited for the employees to arrive. Instead of walking into an open bank with guns drawn, they planned to let the bank open around them. The plan began to break down as soon as Horace Grissow arrived for work. After unlocking the front door, he was confronted by the armed men hiding inside and ordered to open the bank's safe. Grissow retrieved the combination, but under the pressure of the robbery, he struggled with the lock. The delay made one of Dillinger's companions increasingly nervous, and according to Grissow's later account, the man suggested shooting him because he believed he was deliberately stalling. Dillinger refused and told Grissow to keep working. Grissow eventually opened the safe, but another problem remained. He could not open one of the cash drawers. The robbers now had no choice but to stay inside and wait. As the minutes passed, the bank began filling with people who had no idea a robbery was underway. Employee Matta Taylor arrived and was taken prisoner. Then local farmer Grant Widener walked in carrying a check he intended to deposit. Every new arrival meant another person to control, another chance for someone to resist, and another minute in which the robbery could collapse. The situation finally shifted when cashier Carl Enoch arrived. Enoch could open the cash drawer, Grissow could not, giving the robbers access to the money they had been waiting for. With the bank's employees and customers restrained, Dillinger and his companions gathered the cash and prepared to escape. They avoided the front entrance and instead climbed back through the same rear window that they had used to enter, then ran across the property behind the bank towards their waiting automobile. While movement caught the attention of nearby resident Martha Weeks, who noticed unfamiliar men crossing her yard, She alerted another neighbor, and the two women approached the bank to investigate. By the time that they had discovered the people tied up inside, Dillinger and his companions were already leaving New Carlisle. According to the local account, the robbers scattered nails along the roads behind them in an effort to disable any vehicle that tried to follow. The robbery had worked. No one inside the bank had been shot, and Dillinger and his companions escaped before local authorities could organize a pursuit. Early newspaper report estimates that roughly $10,000 had been taken, but bank officials completed their accounting. The loss was reported as $10,500 in cash and another $600 in Liberty bonds. For Dillinger, however, the most important result may have been that something could not have been counted. Only weeks after leaving prison, he had successfully carried out his first bank robbery and using the kind of planning that he had learned from experienced criminals behind bars. He had entered the bank before opening, controlled the employees as they arrived, taken money and escaped without being captured. New Carlisle proved that the lessons Dillinger had spent years absorbing behind bars could work outside of them. His first bank robbery was over, but the criminal career that would make John Dillinger one of the most hunted men in America had only begun. On the afternoon of October 22nd, 1934, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd walked out of the woods near East Liverpool, Ohio, hungry, exhausted, and trying to find a way home. He knocked on the door of a farmhouse and told the widow who answered that he was a hunter who had become lost. She gave him something to eat, and Floyd reportedly paid her $1 for the meal. Then he asked if someone could give him a ride. For perhaps the first time in 2 days, escape seemed possible. But as Floyd prepared to leave, two automobiles carrying federal agents and local police came down the road. Minutes later, America's public enemy number one was dying beneath an apple tree. How did a simple automobile accident turn Pretty Boy Floyd's journey home into the final hours of his life? 2 days earlier, Floyd had been traveling west through Ohio with Adam Ricchetti and two women, intending to return towards Oklahoma. Floyd had spent years robbing banks and avoiding capture, and after John Dillinger's death that summer, authorities had elevated him to the most wanted ranks of America's Depression-era outlaws. But early on October 20th, their Ford skidded into a telephone pole near Wellsville, Ohio. Floyd and Ricchetti removed their weapons and waited outside town while the women took the damaged automobile to be repaired. Suspicious residents noticed two men, and Wellsville Police Chief John Foltz went to investigate. Gunfire followed. Ricchetti was captured, but Floyd disappeared into the countryside alone. From that moment, Floyd's desire was no longer complicated. He needed transportation, food, and a way out of eastern Ohio. Federal agents and local police began searching roads, farms, hospitals, and rural communities throughout that area. Authorities believe Floyd might have been wounded during the confrontation at Wellsville, so doctors at medical facilities were checked as well. For roughly 2 days, he moved through unfamiliar countryside while the search tightened around him. The bank robber who had escaped police traps across the Midwest was now without his partner, without his automobile, and hundreds of miles from the Oklahoma hills he considers home. By Monday afternoon, October 22nd, hunger finally pushed Floyd towards the farmhouse of Ellen Conkle near Clarkson, a few miles from East Liverpool. According to local accounts, Floyd presented himself as a lost hunter. Conkle fed him, and he reportedly gave her $1 and asked about obtaining a ride. Her brother Stuart Dyke agreed to drive him. It was an extraordinary moment of normalcy in the middle of one of the largest manhunts in the region. Floyd had found food, a car, and someone willing to take him away from the area. Had the timing been slightly different, he might have disappeared again. Instead, they were preparing to leave. Two cars appeared on the country road. Inside of those automobiles were 4 federal agents led by Melvin Purvis and 4 East Liverpool police officers headed by Chief Hugh McDermott. The officers had been patrolling the rural roads and questioning people whether they'd noticed activity around the Conkle farm. Floyd immediately realized what was happening and ran. According to the federal account, he emerged with a .45 caliber automatic pistol in his hands and sprinted across the field toward a line of trees while officers repeatedly ordered him to stop. Gunfire followed. Floyd fell before reaching the woods. When the officers reached him, he reportedly said, "I'm done for," "You've hit me twice." 2 pistols were taken from him, and officers attempted to obtain medical help. But this is where the story becomes less certain. Decades later, East Liverpool patrolman Chester Smith gave a dramatically different version of the shooting. Smith claimed that he fired the first shots from his Winchester rifle and deliberately brought Floyd down without killing him. In Smith's later account, Floyd was alive and disarmed when Purvis approached and questioned him. A far more controversial version attributed to Smith's claim that after Floyd refused to cooperate, Purvis ordered another federal agent to shoot him. The FBI strongly disputed that story. Agent Winfred Hopton, who was present, maintained that Floyd had been mortally wounded during the initial attempt to escape and that the agent Smith identified as delivering the final shots was not even there. The surviving accounts have never fit neatly together. What is certain is that Floyd never left the Conkle farm alive. Federal records say that he died roughly 15 minutes after being shot. His body was taken to the East Liverpool, where thousands of people crowded around the funeral home, hoping to see the outlaw whose name had filled the papers across the country. He was then returned to Oklahoma. On October 28th, an estimated 20,000 people gathered for his funeral at Atkins Cemetery, one of the largest funerals Oklahoma had ever seen. The man authorities had hunted as public enemy number 1 returned home only after the journey he had been attempting to make was over. Pretty Boy Floyd spent years surviving robberies, gunfights, police ambushes, and nationwide manhunts. Yet the chain of events that finally ended his life began with something almost ordinary: a car sliding into a telephone pole on a foggy Ohio road. 2 days later, he was alone, hungry, and sitting at a stranger's table eating what would become his last meal. A widow offered him kindness, her brother offered him a ride, and at that exact moment, Floyd thought he had found another way out. The men hunting him appeared at the end of the road. We know where Pretty Boy Floyd died, and we know when. But more than 90 years later, exactly what happened during those final minutes in that Ohio field remains part history, part conflicting testimony, and part mystery. Thank you for taking the time to watch, like, and subscribe to the channel. If you would like to further support the Eclectic Historical Society, you can join our Patreon and order merch from our website, eclectichistoricalsociety.com. With that being said, this is the Eclectic Historical Society, and remember, history is lost if it isn't repeated.